Section 27 of Memories of My Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memories of My Life by Sarah Bernhardt. New York and Boston. I took 2 days' rest before going to the theater, for I could feel the movement of the boat all the time. My head was dizzy, and it seemed to me as though the ceiling moved up and down. The 12 days on the sea had quite upset my health. I sent a line to the stage manager telling him that we would rehearse on Wednesday, and on that day, as soon as luncheon was over, I went to the Booth Theater, where our performances were to take place. At the door reserved for the artistes, I saw a compact, swaying crowd, very much animated and gesticulating. These strange-looking individuals did not belong to the artiste world. They were not reporters either, for I know them too well, alas, to be mistaken in them. They were not there out of curiosity either, these people, but they seemed too much occupied, and then, too, they were only men. When my carriage drew up, one of them rushed forward to the door of it and then returned to the swaying crowd. "Here she is! Here she is!" I heard. And then all these common men with their white neckties and questionable-looking hands, with their coats flying open and trousers whose knees were worn and dirty-looking, crowded behind me into the narrow passage leading to the staircase. I did not feel very easy in my mind, and I mounted the stairs rapidly. Several persons were waiting for me at the top: Mr. Abbey, Jarrett, and also some reporters, 2 gentlemen, and a charming and most distinguished woman whose friendship I have kept ever since, although she does not care much for French people. I saw Mr. Abbey, who was usually very dignified and cold, advance in the most gracious and courteous way to one of the men who were following me. They raised their hats to each other and, followed by the strange and brutal-looking regiment, they advanced toward the center of the stage. I then saw the strangest of sights. In the middle of the stage were my 42 trunks. In obedience to a sign, 20 of the men came forward, and placing themselves, each one between 2 trunks, with a quick movement with their right and left hands, they lifted the lids of the trunks on the right and left of them. Jarrett, with frowns and an unpleasant grin, held out my keys to them. He had asked me that morning for my keys for the customs. "Oh, it's nothing," he said. "Don't be uneasy." And the way in which my luggage had always been respected in other countries had given me perfect confidence about it. The principal personage of the ugly group came toward me accompanied by Abbey, and Jarrett explained things to me. The man was an official from the American Custom House. The Custom Office is an abominable institution in every country, but worse in America than anywhere else. I was prepared for all this and was most affable to the tormentor of a traveler's patience. He raised the melon which served him for a hat, and, without taking his cigar out of his mouth, made some incomprehensible remark to me. He then turned to his regiment of men, made an abrupt sign with his hand, and uttered some word of command, whereupon the 40 dirty hands of these 20 men proceeded to forage among my velvets, satins, and laces. I rushed forward to save my poor dresses from such outrageous violations, and I ordered our costume maker to lift my gowns out one at a time, which he accordingly did, aided by my maid, who was in tears at the small amount of respect shown by these boors to all my beautiful, fragile things. 2 ladies had just arrived, very noisy and businesslike. One of them was short and stout. Her nose seemed to begin at the roots of her hair. She had round, placid-looking eyes and a mouth like a snout. Her arms she was hiding timidly behind her heavy, flabby bust, and her ungainly knees seemed to come straight out of her groin. She looked like a seated cow. Her companion was like a terrapin, with her little black, evil-looking head at the end of a neck which was too long and very stringy. She kept shooting it out of her boa and drawing it back with the most incredible rapidity. The rest of her body bulged out. These two delightful persons were the dressmakers sent for by the custom house to estimate my costumes. They glanced at me in a furtive way and gave a little bow, full of bitterness and jealous rage at the sight of my dresses, and I was quite aware that two more enemies had now come upon the scene. These two odious shrews began to chatter and argue, pawing and crumpling my dresses and cloaks at the same time. They kept exclaiming in the most emphatic way, "Oh, how beautiful! What magnificence! What luxury! All our customers will want gowns like these, and we shall never be able to make them. It will be the ruin of all the American dressmakers." They were working up the judges into a state of excitement for this chiffon court-martial. They kept lamenting, then going into raptures and asking for justice against foreign invasion. The ugly band of men nodded their heads in approval and spat on the ground to affirm their independence. Suddenly the terrapin turned on one of the inquisitors. "Oh, isn't it beautiful? Show it them, show it them," she exclaimed, seizing on a dress all embroidered with pearls, which I wore in La Dame aux Camélias. "This dress is worth at least $10,000, she said, and then, coming up to me, she asked, "How much did you pay for that dress, madame?" I ground my teeth together and would not answer, but just at that moment I should have enjoyed seeing the terrapin in one of the saucepans in the Albemarle Hotel kitchen. It was nearly 5:30 and my feet were frozen. I was half dead, too, with fatigue and suppressed anger. The rest of the examination was postponed until the next day. An ugly band of men offered to put everything back in the trunk, but I objected to that. I sent out for 500 yards of blue tarlatan to cover over the mountain of dresses, hats, cloaks, shoes, laces, linen, stockings, furs, gloves, etc., etc. They then made me take my oath to remove nothing, for they had such charming confidence in me, and I left my butler there in charge. He was the husband of Phyllis, my maid, and a bed was put up for him on the stage. I was so nervous and upset that I wanted to go somewhere far away, to have some fresh air, and to stay out for a long time. A friend offered to take me to see the Brooklyn Bridge. "That masterpiece of American genius will make you forget the petty miseries of our red tape affairs," he said gently. And so we set out for Brooklyn Bridge. Oh, that bridge! It is insane, admirable, imposing, and it makes one feel proud. Yes, one is proud to be a human being when one realizes that a human brain has created and suspended in the air, 50 yards from the ground, that fearful thing which bears a dozen trains filled with passengers, 10 or 12 tram cars, 100 cabs, carriages and carts, and thousands of foot passengers. And all that moving along together amidst the uproar of the music of the metals, clanging, clashing, grating, and groaning under the enormous weight of people and things. The movement of the air caused by this frightful, tempestuous coming and going caused me to feel giddy and stopped my breath. I made a sign for the carriage to stand still and I closed my eyes. I then had a strange, indefinable sensation of universal chaos. I opened my eyes again when my brain was a little more tranquil, and I saw New York stretching out along the river, wearing its night ornaments, which glittered as much through its dress with thousands of electric lights as the firmament with its tunic of stars. I returned to the hotel reconciled with this great nation. I went to sleep tired in body but rested in mind, and had such delightful dreams that I was in a good humor the following day. I adore dreams, and my sad, unhappy days are those which follow dreamless nights. My great grief is that I cannot choose my dreams. How many times I have done all in my power at the end of a happy day to make myself dream a continuation of it. How many times I have called up the faces of those I love just before falling asleep. But my thoughts wander and carry me off elsewhere, and I prefer that, or even a disagreeable dream, to none at all. When I am asleep, my body has an infinite sense of enjoyment, but it is torture to me for my thoughts to slumber. My vital forces rebel against such negation of life. I am quite willing to die once for all, but I object to slight deaths such as those of which one has the sensation on dreamless nights. When I awoke, my maid told me that Jarrett was waiting for me to go to the theater, so that the valuation of my costumes could be terminated. I sent word to Jarrett that I had seen quite enough of the regiment from the custom house, and I asked him to finish everything without me, as Madame Gerard would be there. During the next 2 days, the terrapin, the seated cow, and the black band made notes for the custom house, took sketches for the papers, and patterns of my dresses for customers. I began to get impatient, as we ought to have been rehearsing. Finally, I was told on Thursday morning that the business was over, and that I could not have my trunks until I had paid 28,000 francs for duty. I was seized with such a violent fit of laughing that poor Abby, who had been terrified, caught it from me, and even Jarrett showed his cruel teeth. "My dear Abby," I exclaimed, "arrange as you like about it, but I must make my debut on Monday, the 8th of November, and today is Thursday. I shall be at the theater on Monday to dress. See that I have my trunks, for there was nothing about the custom house in my contract. I will pay half, though, of what you have to give." The 28,000 francs were handed over to an attorney who made a claim in my name on the Board of Customs. My trunks were left with me, thanks to this deposit, and the rehearsal commenced at Booth's Theater. On Monday evening, November 8th at 8:30, the curtain rose for the first performance of Adrienne Lecouvreur. The house was crowded, and the seats, which had been sold to the highest bidders and then sold by them again, had fetched exorbitant prices. I was awaited with impatience and curiosity, but not with any sympathy. There were no young girls present, as the piece was too immoral. Poor Adrienne Lecouvreur. The audience was very polite to the artistes of my company, but rather impatient to see the strange person who had been announced to them. The curtain fell at the end of the first act, and Adrienne had not appeared. One of the audience, very much annoyed, asked to see Mr. Henry Abbey. "I want my money back," he said, "as Le Bernhardt is not in every act." Abbey refused to return the money to the extraordinary individual, and as the curtain was going up, he hurried back to take possession of his seat again. My appearance was greeted by several rounds of applause, which I believe had been paid for in advance by Abbey and Jarrett. I commenced, and the sweetness of my voice, as in the fable of the two pigeons, worked the miracle. The whole house this time burst out into hurrahs. A current of sympathy was established between my public and myself, instead of the hysterical skeleton that had been announced to them. They had before them a very frail-looking creature with a sweet voice. The fourth act was applauded, and Adrienne's rebellion against the Princesse de Bouillon stirred the whole house. Finally, in the fifth act, when the unfortunate artiste is dying, poisoned by her rival, there was quite a manifestation, and everyone was deeply moved. At the end of the third act, all the young men were sent off by the ladies to find all the musicians they could get together, and to my surprise and delight on arriving at my hotel, A charming serenade was played for me while I was at supper. The crowd had assembled under my windows at the Albemarle Hotel, and I was obliged to go out onto the balcony several times to bow and to thank this public, which I had been told I should find cold and prejudiced against me. From the bottom of my heart, I also thanked all my detractors and slanderers, as it was through them that I had had the pleasure of fighting with the certainty of conquering. The victory was all the more enjoyable, as I had not dared to hope for it. I gave 27 performances in New York. The plays were Adrienne Lecouvreur, Frou Frou, Hernani, La Dame aux Camélias, Le Sphinx, L'étrangère. The average receipts were 20,342 francs for each performance, including matinees. The last performance was given on Saturday, December 4th, as a matinee, for my company had to leave that night for Boston, and I had reserved the evening to go to Mr. Edison at Menlo Park, where I had a reception worthy of fairyland. Oh, that matinee of Saturday, December 4th. I can never forget it. When I got to the theater to dress, it was midday, for the matinee was to commence at 1:30. My carriage stopped, not being able to get along, for the street was filled by ladies, sitting on chairs which they had borrowed from the neighboring shops, or on folding seats which they had brought themselves. The play was La Dame aux Camélias. I had to get out of my carriage and walk about 25 yards on foot in order to get to the stage door. It took me 25 minutes to do it. People shook my hands and begged me to come back. One lady took off her brooch and pinned it in my mantle, a modest brooch of amethysts surrounded by fine pearls, but certainly for the giver the brooch had its value. I was stopped at every step. One lady pulled out her notebook and begged me to write my name. The idea took like lightning. Small boys, under the care of their parents, wanted me to write my name on their cuffs. My arms were full of small bouquets which had been pushed into my hands. I felt behind me someone tugging at the feather in my hat. I turned round sharply. A woman with a pair of scissors in her hand had tried to cut off a lock of my hair, but she had only succeeded in cutting the feather out of my hat. In vain, Jarrett signaled and shouted. I could not get along. They sent for the police, who delivered me, but without any ceremony, either for my admirers or for myself. They were real brutes, those policemen, and made me very angry. I played La Dame aux Camélias, and I counted 17 calls after the third act and 29 after the fifth. In consequence of the cheering and calls, the play had lasted an hour longer than usual, and I was half dead with fatigue. I was just about to go to my carriage and get back to my hotel when Jared came to tell me that there were more than 50,000 people waiting outside. I fell back on a chair, tired and disheartened. Oh, I will wait till the crowd is dispersed. I am tired out. I can do no more. But Henry Abbey had an inspiration of genius. Stay, said he to my sister. Put on Madame's hat and boa and take my arm, and take also these bouquets. Give me what you cannot carry, and now we will go to your sister's carriage and make our vow. He said all this in English, and Jarrett translated it to my sister, who lent herself to this little comedy very willingly. During this time, Jarrett and I got into Abby's carriage, which was stationed in front of the theater where no one was waiting, and it was fortunate we took this course, for my sister only got back to the Albemarle Hotel an hour later, very tired, but very much amused. Her resemblance to myself, my hat, my boa, and the darkness of night had been the accomplices of the little comedy which we had offered to my enthusiastic public. We had to set out at 9 o'clock for Menlo Park. We had to dress in traveling costume. For the following day we were to leave for Boston, and my trunks had gone that day with my company, which preceded me by several hours. The dinner was, as usual, very bad, for in those days in America the food was unspeakably awful. At 10 o'clock we took the train, a pretty special train, all decorated with flowers and banners, which they had been kind enough to prepare for me. But it was a painful journey all the same, for at each instant we had to pull up to allow another train to pass, or an engine to maneuver, or to wait to pass over the points. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when the train at last reached the station at Menlo Park, the residence of Thomas Edison. It was a very dark night and the snow was falling silently in heavy flakes. A carriage was waiting, and the one lamp of this carriage served to light up the whole station, for orders had been given that the electric lights should be put out. I found my way with the help of Jared and some of my friends who had accompanied us from New York. The intense cold froze the snow as it fell, and we walked over veritable blocks of sharp, jagged ice, which crackled under our feet. Behind the first carriage was another heavier one, with only one horse and no lamp. There was room for 5 or 6 persons to crowd into this. We were 10 in all. Jared, Abby, my sister, and I took our places in the first one, leaving the others to get into the second. We looked like a band of conspirators. The dark night, the 2 mysterious carriages, the silence caused by the icy coldness, the way in which we were muffled in our furs, and our anxious expressions as we glanced around us. All this made our visit to the celebrated Edison resemble a scene out of an operetta. The carriage rolled along, sinking deep into the snow and jolting terribly. The jolts made us dread every instant some tragi-comic accident. I cannot tell how long we had been rolling along for, lulled by the movement of the carriage and buried in our warm furs. I was quietly dozing when a formidable hip-hip hurrah made us all jump. My traveling companions, the coachman, the horse, and I. As quick as thought, the whole country was suddenly illuminated. Under the trees, on the trees, among the bushes, along the garden walks, lights flashed forth triumphantly. The wheels of the carriage turned a few more times and then drew up at the house of the famous Thomas Edison. A group of people awaited us on the veranda, 4 men, 2 ladies, and a young girl. My heart began to beat quickly as I wondered which of these men was Edison. I had never seen his photograph, and I had the greatest admiration for his genius. I sprang out of the carriage, and the dazzling electric light made it seem like daytime to us. I took the bouquet which Mrs. Edison offered me and thanked her for it, but all the time I was endeavoring to discover which of these was the great man. They all 4 advanced toward me, but I noticed the flush that came into the face of one of them, and it was so evident from the expression of his blue eyes that he was intensely bored that I guessed this was Edison. I felt confused and embarrassed myself, for I knew very well that I was causing inconvenience to this man by my visit. He, of course, imagined that it was due to the idle curiosity of a foreigner, eager to court publicity. He was no doubt thinking of the interviewing in store for him the following day, and of the stupidities he would be made to utter. He was suffering beforehand at the idea of the ignorant questions I should ask him, of all the explanations he would, out of politeness, be obliged to give me. And at that moment Thomas Edison took a dislike to me. His wonderful blue eyes, more luminous than his incandescent lamps, enabled me to read his thoughts. I immediately understood that he must be won over, and my combative instinct had recourse to all my powers of fascination in order to vanquish this delightful but bashful savant. I made such an effort and succeeded so well that, half an hour later, we were the best of friends. I followed him about quickly, climbing up staircases as narrow and steep as ladders, crossing bridges suspended in the air above veritable furnaces, and he explained everything to me. I understood all, and I admired him more and more, for he was so simple and charming, this king of light. As we leaned over a slightly unsteady bridge, above the terrible abyss in which immense wheels, encased in wide thongs, were turning, tacking about, and rumbling. He gave various orders in a clear voice, and light then burst forth on all sides, sometimes in sputtering greenish jets, sometimes in quick flashes, or in serpentine trails like streams of fire. I looked at this man of medium size, with rather a large head and a noble-looking profile, and I thought of Napoleon I. There is certainly a great physical resemblance between these two men, and I am sure that one compartment of their brain would be found to be identical. Of course, I do not compare their genius. The one was destructive, and the other creative. But while I execrate battles, I adore victories, and, in spite of his errors, I have raised an altar in my heart to that God of glory, Napoleon. I therefore looked at Edison thoughtfully, for he reminded me of the great man who was dead. The deafening sound of the machinery, the dazzling rapidity of the changes of light, all that together made my head whirl, and, forgetting where I was, I leaned for support on the slight balustrade which separated me from the abyss beneath. I was so unconscious of all danger that, before I had recovered from my surprise, Edison had helped me into an adjoining room and installed me in an armchair, without my realizing how it had all happened. He told me afterwards that I had turned dizzy. After having done the honors of his telephonic discovery and of his astonishing phonograph, Edison offered me his arm and took me to the dining room, where I found his family assembled. I was very tired, and did justice to the supper that had been so hospitably prepared for us. I left Menlo Park at 4 o'clock in the morning, and this time the country round, the roads, the stations were all lighted up, a giorno, by the thousands of jets of my kind host. What a strange power of suggestion the darkness has. I thought I had traveled a long way that night, and it seemed to me that the roads were impracticable. It proved to be quite a short distance, and the roads were charming, although they were covered with snow. Imagination had played a great part during the journey to Edison's house, but reality played a much greater one during the same journey back to the station. I was enthusiastic in my admiration of the inventions of this man, and I was charmed with his timid graciousness and perfect courtesy, and with his profound love of Shakespeare. The next day, or rather that same day, for it was then 4 in the morning, I started after my company for Boston. Mr. Abbey, my impresario, had arranged for me to have a delightful car, but it was nothing like the wonderful Pullman car that I was to have from Philadelphia for continuing my tour. I was very much pleased with this one, nevertheless. In the middle of the room there was a real bed, large and comfortable, on a brass bedstead. Then there was an armchair, a pretty dressing table, a basket tied up with ribbons for my dog, and flowers everywhere, but flowers without overpowering perfume. In the car adjoining me were my own servants, who were also very comfortable. I went to bed feeling thoroughly satisfied and woke up at Boston. A large crowd was assembled at the station. There were reporters and curious men and women, a public decidedly more interested than friendly, not badly intentioned, but by no means enthusiastic. Public opinion in New York had been greatly occupied with me during the past month. I had been so much criticized and glorified. Calumnies of all kinds, stupid and disgusting, foolish and odious, had been circulated about me. Some people blamed and others admired the disdain with which I had treated these turpitudes. But everyone knew that I had won in the end, and that I had triumphed over all and everything. Boston knew, too, The clergymen had preached from their pulpits, saying that I had been sent by the old world to corrupt the new world, that my art was an inspiration from hell, etc., etc. Everyone knew all this, but the public wanted to see for itself. Boston belongs especially to the women. Tradition says that it was a woman who first set foot in Boston. Women form the majority there. They are puritanical with intelligence and independent with a certain grace. I passed between the two lines formed by this strange, courteous, and cold crowd, and just as I was about to get into my carriage, a lady advanced toward me and said, "Welcome to Boston, Madame." "Welcome, Madame," and she held out a soft little hand to me. American women generally have charming hands and feet. Other people now approached and smiled, and I had to shake hands with many of them. I took a fancy to this city at once, but all the same I was furious for a moment when a reporter sprang onto the steps of the carriage just as we were driving away. He was in a greater hurry and more audacious than any of the others, but he was certainly overstepping the limits, and I pushed the wretched man back angrily. Jarrett was prepared for this and saved him by the collar of his coat. Otherwise he would have fallen down on the pavement as he deserved. "At what time will you come and get on the whale tomorrow?" this extraordinary personage asked. I gazed at him in bewilderment. He spoke French perfectly and repeated his question. "He's mad," I said in a low voice to Jarrett. "No, Madame, I am not mad, but I should like to know at what time you will come and get on the whale. It would be perhaps better to come this evening, for we are afraid it may die in the night, and it would be a pity for you not to come and pay it a visit while it still has breath." He went on talking, and as he talked, he half seated himself beside Jarrett, who was still holding him by the collar, lest he should fall out of the carriage. "But, monsieur," I exclaimed, "what do you mean? What is all this about a whale?" "Ah, Madame," he replied, "it is admirable, enormous. It is in the harbor basin, and there are men employed day and night to break the ice all round it." He broke off suddenly, and standing on the carriage step, he clutched the driver. "Stop, stop," he called out. Hi, Henry, come here. Here's Madame. Here she is." The carriage drew up, and without any further ceremony, he jumped down and pushed into my carriage a little man, square all over, who was wearing a fur cap pulled down over his eyes, and an enormous diamond in his cravat. He was the strangest type of the old-fashioned Yankee. He did not speak a word of French, but he took his seat calmly by Jarrett, while the reporter remained half sitting and half hanging onto the vehicle. There had been 3 of us when we started from the station, and we were 5 when we reached the Hotel Vendôme. There were a great many people awaiting my arrival, and I was quite ashamed of my new companion. He talked in a loud voice, laughed, coughed, spat, addressed everyone, and gave everyone invitations. All the people seemed to be delighted. A little girl threw her arms round her father's neck, exclaiming, "Oh, yes, Papa, do please let us go." "Well, but we must ask Madame," he replied, and he came up to me in the most polite and courteous manner. "Will you kindly allow us to join your party when you go to see the whale tomorrow?" he asked. "But, monsieur," I answered, delighted to have to do with a gentleman once more, "I have no idea what all this means." For the last quarter of an hour, this reporter and that extraordinary man have been talking about a whale. They declare authoritatively that I must go and pay it a visit, and I know absolutely nothing about it at all. These 2 gentlemen took my carriage by storm, installed themselves in it without my permission, and, as you see, are giving invitations in my name to people I do not know, asking them to go with me to a place about which I know nothing, for the purpose of paying a visit to a whale, which is to be introduced to me, and which is waiting impatiently to die in peace. The kindly disposed gentleman signed to his daughter to come with us, and accompanied by them, and by Jared and Madame Gerard, I went up in the elevator to the door of my suite of rooms. I found my apartments hung with valuable pictures and full of magnificent statues. I felt rather disturbed in my mind, for among these objects of art were 2 or 3 very rare and beautiful things, which I knew must have cost an exorbitant price. I was afraid lest any of them should be stolen, and I spoke of my fear to the proprietor of the hotel. Mr. X, to whom the knickknacks belong, he answered, wishes you to have them to look at as long as you are here, mademoiselle. And when I expressed my anxiety about them to him, just as you have done to me, he merely remarked that it was all the same to him. As to the pictures, they belonged to 2 wealthy Bostonians. There was among them a superb Malay which I should have liked very much to own. After expressing my gratitude and admiring these treasures, I asked for an explanation of the story of the whale, and Mr. Max Gordon, the father of the little girl, translated for me what the little man in the fur cap had said. It appeared that he owned several fishing boats which he sent out for cod fishing for his own benefit. One of these boats had captured an enormous whale, which still had the 2 harpoons in it. The poor creature, thoroughly exhausted with its struggles, was several miles along the coast, but it had been easy to capture it and bring it in triumph to Henry Smith, the owner of the boats. It was difficult to say by what freak of fancy and by what turn of the imagination this man had arrived at associating in his mind the idea of the whale and my name as a source of wealth. I could not understand it, but the fact remained that he insisted in such a droll way and so authoritatively and energetically that the following morning at 7 o'clock, 50 persons assembled, in spite of the icy cold rain, to visit the basin of the quay. Mr. Gordon had given orders that his mail coach with 4 beautiful horses should be in readiness. He drove himself and his daughter, Jared, my sister, Madame Gerard, and another elderly lady whose name I have forgotten, were with us. 7 other carriages followed. It was all very amusing indeed. On our arrival at the quay, we were received by this comic Henry, shaggy-looking this time from head to foot, and his hands encased in fingerless woolen gloves. Only his eyes and his huge diamond shone out from his furs. I walked along the quay, very much amused and interested. There were a few idlers looking on also, and alas, 3 times over, alas, there were reporters. Henry Shaggy Paw then seized my hand and he drew me along with him quickly to the staircase. I barely escaped breaking my neck at least a dozen times. He pushed me along, made me stumble down the 10 steps of the basin, and I next found myself on the back of the whale. They assured me that it still breathed. I should not like to affirm that it really did, but the splashing of the water breaking its eddy against the poor creature caused it to oscillate slightly. Then, too, it was covered with glazed frost, and twice I fell down full length on its spine. I laugh about it now, but I was furious then. Everyone around me insisted, however, on my pulling a piece of the shattered whalebone from the mouth of the poor wounded creature, a sliver of that bone, from which those little ribs are made which are used for women's corsets. I did not like to do this, as I feared to cause it suffering, and I was sorry for the poor thing, as 3 of us, Henry, the little Gordon girl, and I, had been skating about on its back for the last 10 minutes. Finally, I decided to do it. I pulled out the little piece of whalebone and went up the steps again, holding my poor trophy in my hand. I felt nervous and flustered, and everyone surrounded me. I was annoyed with this man. I did not want to return to the coach, as I thought I could hide my bad temper better in one of the huge, gloomy-looking landaus which followed. But the charming Miss Gordon asked me so sweetly why I would not drive with them, that I felt my anger melt away before the child's smiling face. "Would you like to drive?" her father asked me, and I accepted with pleasure. Jared immediately proceeded to get down from the coach as quickly as his age and corpulence would allow him. "If you were going to drive, I prefer getting down," he said, and he took his place in another carriage. I changed seats boldly with Mr. Gordon in order to drive, and we had not gone 100 yards before I had let the horses make for a chemist shop along the quay, and got the coach itself up onto the footpath, so that if it had not been for the quickness and energy of Mr. Gordon, we should all have been killed. On arriving at the hotel, I went to bed and stayed there until it was time for the theater in the evening. End of section 27.
Section 28 of Memories of My Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kristen Hand. Memories of My Life by Sarah Bernhardt. I Visit Montreal. We played Hernani that night to a full house. The seats had been sold to the highest bidders, and considerable prices were obtained for them. We gave 15 performances at Boston at an average of 19,000 francs for each performance. I was sorry to leave that city, as I had spent 2 charming weeks there, my mind all the time on the alert when holding conversations with the Boston women. They are Puritans from the crown of the head to the sole of the foot, but they are indulgent, and there is no bitterness about their Puritanism. What struck me most about the women of Boston was the harmony and softness of their gestures. Brought up amongst the severest and harshest of traditions, the Bostonian race seems to me to be the most refined and the most mysterious of all the American races. As the women are in the majority in Boston, many of the young girls will remain unmarried. All their vital forces which they cannot expend in love and in maternity, they employ in fortifying and making supple the beauty of their body by means of exercise and sports, without losing any of their grace. All the reserves of heart are expended in intellectuality. They adore music, the theater, literature, painting, and poetry. They know everything and understand everything, are chaste and reserved, and neither laugh nor talk very loudly. They are as far removed from the Latin race as the North Pole is from the South Pole, but they are interesting, delightful, and captivating. It was, therefore, with a rather heavy heart that I left Boston for New Haven, and to my great surprise, on arriving at the hotel at New Haven, I found Henry Smith there, the famous whaleman. "Oh, heavens!" I exclaimed, flinging myself into an armchair. "What does this man want now with me?" I was not left in ignorance very long, for the most infernal noise of brass instruments, drums, trumpets, and I should think saucepans, drew me to the window. I saw an immense carriage surrounded by an escort of negroes dressed as minstrels. On this carriage was an abominable, monstrous, colored advertisement representing me standing on the whale, tearing away its blade while it struggled to defend itself. Some sandwich men followed with posters on which were written the following words: "Come and see the enormous cetacea which Sarah Bernhardt killed by tearing out its whalebone for her corsets. These are made by Madame Lily Noé, who lives, etc." Still other sandwich men carried posters with these words: "The whale is just as flourishing as when it was alive. It has $500 worth of salt in its stomach, and every day the ice upon which it was resting is renewed at a cost of $100. My face turned more livid than that of a corpse, and my teeth chattered with fury on seeing this. Henry Smith advanced toward me, and I struck him in my anger, and then rushed away to my room, where I sobbed with vexation, disgust, and utter weariness. I wanted to start back to Europe at once, but Jarrett showed me my contract. I then wanted to take steps to have this odious exhibition stopped, and in order to calm me, I was promised that this should be done. But in reality, nothing was done at all. 2 days later, I was at Hartford, and the same whale was there. It continued its tour as I continued mine. They gave it more salt and renewed its ice, and it went on its way, so that I came across it everywhere. I took proceedings about it, but in every state I was obliged to begin all over again, as the law varied in the different states. And every time I arrived at a fresh hotel, I found there an immense bouquet awaiting me with the horrible card of the showman of the whale. I threw his flowers on the ground and trampled on them, and as much as I love flowers, I had a horror of these. Jarrett went to see the man and begged him not to send me any more bouquets, but it was all of no use, as it was the man's way of avenging the box on the ears I had given him. Then, too, he could not understand my anger. He was making any amount of money and had even proposed that I should accept a percentage of the receipts. Ah, I would willingly have killed that execrable Smith, for he was poisoning my life. I could see nothing else in all the different cities I visited, and I used to shut my eyes on the way from hotel to theater. When I heard the minstrels, I used to fly into a rage and turn green with anger. Fortunately, I was able to rest when once I reached Montreal, where I was not followed by this show. I should certainly have been ill if it had continued, as I saw nothing but that. I could think of nothing else, and my very dreams were about it. It haunted me. It was an obsession and a perpetual nightmare. When I left Hartford, Jarrett swore to me that Smith would not be at Montreal, as he had been taken suddenly ill. I strongly suspected that Jarrett had found a way of administering to him some violent kind of medicine which had stopped his journeying for the time. I felt sure of this, as the ferocious gentleman laughed so heartily en route, but anyhow I was infinitely grateful to him for ridding me of the man for the present. For a long time, ever since my earliest childhood, I had dreamed about Canada. I had always heard my godfather regret, with considerable fury, the surrender of that territory by France to England. I had heard him enumerate, without very clearly understanding them, the pecuniary advantages of Canada, the immense fortune that lay in its lands, etc., and that country had seemed, to my imagination, the far-off promised land. Awakened some considerable time previous by the strident whistle of the engine, I asked what time it was. 11 o'clock, I was informed. We were within 15 minutes of the station. The sky was black and smooth like a steel shield. Lanterns placed at distant intervals caught the whiteness of the snow heaped up there for how many days. The train stopped suddenly and then started again with such a slow and timid movement that I fancied that there might be a possibility of its running off the rails. But a deadened sound, growing louder every second, fell upon my attentive ears. This sound soon resolved itself into music, and it was in the midst of a formidable hurrah, long live France, shouted by 10,000 throats, strengthened by an orchestra playing the Marseillaise with a frenzied fury, that we made our entry into Montreal. The place where the train stopped in those days was very narrow. A somewhat high bank served as a rampart for the slight platform of the station. Standing on the small step of my carriage, I looked with emotion upon the strange spectacle I had before me. The bank was packed with bears holding lanterns. There were hundreds and hundreds of them. In the narrow space between the bank and the train, which had come to a stop, there were more bears, large and small, and I wondered with terror how I should manage to reach my sleigh. Jarrett and Abby caused the crowd to make way, and I got out, but a deputy, whose name I cannot make out in my notes, what commendation for my writing! A deputy advanced toward me and handed me an address signed by the notabilities of the city. I returned thanks as best I could, and took the magnificent bouquet of flowers that was tendered in the name of the signatories to the address. When I lifted the flowers to my face in order to smell them, I hurt myself slightly with their pretty petals frozen by the cold. However, I began to feel both arms and legs were getting benumbed. The cold crept over my whole body. That night, it appears, was one of the coldest that had been experienced for many years past. The women who had come to be present at the arrival of the French company had been compelled to withdraw into the interior of the station, with the exception of Mrs. Joseph Doubt, who handed me a bouquet of rare flowers and gave me a kiss. It was 22 degrees below zero. I whispered low to Jarrett, "Let us continue our journey. I am turning into ice. In 10 minutes I shall not be able to move a step." Jarrett repeated my words to Abby, who applied to the chief of police. The latter gave orders in English, and another police officer repeated them in French. And we were able to proceed for a few yards, but the station was still some way off. The crowd grew bigger, and at one time I felt as though I were about to faint. I took courage, however, holding, or rather hanging on to the arms of Jarrett and Abby. Every minute I thought I should fall, for the platform was covered with ice. We were obliged, however, to stay further progress. 100 lanterns, held aloft by 100 students' hands, suddenly lit up the place. A tall young man separated himself from the group and came straight toward me, holding a wide, unrolled piece of paper, and in a loud voice exclaimed, "To Sarah Bernhardt!" And these are the lines he read. Sarah Bernhardt. Salut, Sarah. Salut, charmante Doña Sol. Lorsque ton pied mignon vient fouler notre sol tout couvert de givre. Est-ce une frisson d'orgueil ou d'amour? Je ne sais. Mais nous sentons courir dans notre sang français quelque chose qui nous enivre. Femme vaillante à court saturée d'idéal, puisque tu n'as pas craint notre ciel boréal, ni redouté nos froids sévères. Merci de l'hiver pour longtemps prisonnier. Nous rêvons à ta vue aux rayons printaniers qui font fleurir les primavères. Oui, c'est à doux printemps que tu nous fais rêver. Oui, sous des pays bleus, lorsque tu viens braver. L'auréole de nos saisons perfides, au clair rayonnement d'un chaud soleil de mai. Nous croyons voir du fond d'un bosquet parfumé surgir la reine des sylphides. Mais non, de Floréal ni du blond Messidor. Tu n'es pas, ô Sarah, la fille aux ailes d'or, qui vient répandre l'ambroisie. Nous saluons en toi l'artiste radieux, qui sous cuillère d'assaut dans le jardin des dieux, toutes les fleurs de poésie. Que sous ta main la toile animée son réseau, que le paron brillant vive sous ton ciseau, ou l'argile sous ton doigt rose, que sur la scène abruite de l'errant des bravos, un type toujours vrai, quoique toujours nouveau, ton talent se métamorphose. Soit qui, pénétre admirable ou sculpteur souverain, toi-même osses ravir la mousse à front serein. À tes sourires te juge prêté, soit que aux mille vivatés de la foule à genoux, des grands maîtres anciens ou modernes pour nous, ta voix s'efface l'interpréter. Des bords de la Thames aux bords de Saint-Laurent, qu'il soit enfant du peuple ou brille au premier rang, le sang glapir, la calomnie, tour à tour, par ton ouvert et ta grâce enchantée. Chacun courbait la front devant la majesté de ton universel génie. Salut donc, ô Sarah, salut, ô Doña Sol, lorsque ton pied mignon voulait fouler notre sol, te montrer l'indifférence. Serait à notre sang nous-mêmes faire affront, car l'étoile qui lui la plus belle à ton front, c'est encore celle de la France. He read it very well, it is true, but those lines, read with a temperature of 22 degrees of cold, to a poor woman dumbfounded through listening to a frenzied Marseillaise, stunned by the mad hurrahs from 10,000 throats delirious with patriotic fervor, were more than my strength could bear, made me feel dizzy and caused my head to reel. I made superhuman efforts at resistance, but was overwhelmed with fatigue. Everything appeared to be turning round in a mad farandole. I felt myself raised from the ground and heard a voice which seemed to come from afar away. "Make room for our French lady." Then I heard nothing further and only recovered my senses in my room at the Hotel Windsor. My sister Jean had become separated from me by the movement of the crowd, but the poet Frechette, a French-Canadian, became her escort and brought her several minutes after, safe and sound but trembling on my account, and this is what she told me. Just imagine, when the crowd was pressing against you, seized with terror on seeing your head fall back with closed eyes onto Abby's shoulder, I shouted out, "Help! My sister is being killed." I had become mad. A man of enormous size who had followed us for a long time worked his elbows and hips to make the enthusiastic but overwrought mob give way. With a quick movement, placed himself before you, just in time to prevent you from falling. The man, whose face I could not see on account of its being hidden beneath a fur cap, the ear flaps of which covered almost his entire face, raised you up as though you had been a flower, and held forth to the crowd in English. I did not understand anything he said, but the Canadians were struck with it, for the pushing ceased and the crowd separated into two compact files in order to let you pass through. I can assure you that it made me feel quite impressed to see you so slender, with your head back and the whole of your poor frame borne at arm's length by that Hercules. I followed as fast as I could, but having caught my foot in the flounce of my skirt, I had to stop for a second, and that second was enough to separate us completely. The crowd, having closed up after your passage, formed an impenetrable barrier. I can assure you, dear sister, that I felt anything but at ease, and it was Mr. Frechette who saved me. I shook the hand of that worthy gentleman and thanked him this time as well as I could for his fine poem. Then I spoke to him of his other poems, a volume of which I had obtained at New York. For alas, to my shame I must acknowledge it, I knew nothing about Frechette up to the time of my departure from France, yet he was already known a little in Paris. He was very touched with the several lines I dwelt upon as the finest of his work. He thanked me for doing so. We remained friends. The day following, 9 o'clock had hardly struck when a card was sent up to me on which were written these words: "He who had the joy of saving you, madame, begs that your kindness will grant him a moment's interview." I directed that the man be shown into the drawing-room, and after notifying Jarrett, went to awaken my sister. "Come with me," I said. She slipped on a Chinese dressing-gown, and we went in the direction of the huge, immense drawing-room of my apartment, for a bicycle would have been necessary to traverse my rooms, drawing-rooms, and dining-room, for the whole length without fatigue. On opening the door, I was struck with the beauty of the man who was before me. He was very tall, with wide shoulders, small head, a hard look, hair thick and curly, tanned complexion. The man was fine-looking, but seemed uneasy. He blushed slightly on seeing me. I expressed my gratitude and asked to be excused for my foolish weakness. I received joyfully the bouquet of violets he handed me. On taking leave, he said in a low tone, "If ever you hear who I am, swear that you will only think of the slight service I have rendered you." At that moment Jarrett entered with a white face. He went up to the stranger and spoke to him in English. I could, however, catch the words detective, door, assassination, impossibility, New Orleans. His sunburnt complexion became chalky, his nostrils quivered as he looked toward the door. Then, as flight appeared impossible, he looked at Jarrett, and in a peremptory tone, as cold as flint, said, "Well," as he went towards the door. My hands, which had opened under the stupor, let fall his bouquet, which he picked up, looking at me with a supplicating and appealing air. I understood and said to him in a loud tone of voice, "I swear to it, monsieur." The man disappeared with his flowers. I heard the uproar of people behind the door and of the crowd in the street. I did not wish to listen to anything further. When my sister, of a romantic and foolish turn of mind, wished to tell me about the horrible thing, I closed my ears. 4 months afterwards, when an attempt was made to read aloud to me an account of his death by hanging, I refused to hear anything about it. And now, after 26 years have passed, and I only wish to remember the service rendered and my pledged word. The incident left me somewhat sad. The anger of the Bishop of Montreal was necessary to enable me to regain my good humor. That prelate, after holding forth in the pulpit against the immorality of French literature, forbade his flock to go to the theater. His charge was violent and spiteful against modern France. As describes play Adrien Lecorvaisier, he tore it into shreds, as it were, disclaiming against the immoral love of the comédienne and of the hero, and against the adulterous love of the Princess of Bouillon. But the truth showed itself in spite of all, and he cried out with fury intensified by outrage. In this infamous lucubration there are French authors, a coarse abbé who, thanks to the unbounded licentiousness of his expressions, constitutes a direct insult to the clergy. Finally, he pronounced an anathema against Scribe, who was already dead, against Legove, against me, and against all my company. The result was that crowds came from everywhere, and the 4 presentations, Adrien Lecouvrier, Frou-Frou, La Dame au Camelier, afternoon performance, and Hernani had a colossal success and brought in fabulous receipts. I was invited by the poet Frechette and a banker whose name I do not remember to make a visit to Ottawa. I accepted with joy and went there accompanied by my sister, Jarrett, and Angelo, who was always ready for a dangerous excursion. I felt in safety in the presence of that artist, full of bravery and composure, and gifted with Herculean strength. The only thing he lacked to make him perfect was talent. He had none then, and never did have any. The St. Lawrence River was frozen over almost entirely. We crossed it in a carriage along a route indicated on the river by 2 rows of branches fixed in the ice. We had 4 carriages. The distance between Ottawa and Montreal is 125 kilometers. This visit to the Iroquois was deliciously enchanting. I was introduced to the chief, father, and mayor of the Iroquois tribe. Alas, this former chief, son of Big White Eagle, surnamed during his childhood Son of the Knights, now clothed in sorry European rags, was selling liquor, thread, needles, flax, pork fat, chocolate, etc. All that remained of his mad rovings through the old wild forests, when he roamed naked over a land free of all allegiance, was the stupor of the bull held prisoner by the horns. It is true he also sold brandy, and that he quenched his thirst, as did all of them, at that source of forgetfulness. Son of the Knights introduced me to his daughter, a girl of 18 to 20 years of age, insipid and devoid of beauty and grace. She sat down at the piano and played a tune that was popular at the time. I do not remember what. I was in a hurry to leave the store, the home of these 2 victims of civilization. I visited Ottawa, but found no pleasure in it. The same compression of the throat, the same retrospective anguish caused me to revolt against man's cowardice, which hid under the name of civilization the most unjust and most protected of crimes. I returned to Montreal somewhat sad and tired. The success of our 4 performances was extraordinary, but what gave them a special charm in my eyes was the infernal and joyous noise made by the students. The doors of the theater were opened every day 1 hour in advance for them. They then arranged matters to suit themselves. Most of them were gifted with magnificent voices. They separated into groups according to the requirements of the songs they wished to sing. Then they prepared by means of a strong string worked by a pulley the aerial route that was to be followed by the flower-bedecked baskets which descended from their paradise to where I was. They tied ribbons round the necks of doves bearing sonnets and wishes. These flowers and birds were sent off during the calls, and by a happy disposition of the strings, the flowers fell at my feet, the doves flew where their astonishment led them, and every evening these messages of grace and beauty were repeated. I experienced considerable emotion the first evening. The Marquis de Lorne, son-in-law of Queen Victoria, Governor of Canada, was of royal punctuality. The students knew it. The house was noisy and quivering. Through an opening in the curtain I gazed on the composition of this assembly. All of a sudden, a silence came over it without any outward reason for it, and the Marseillaise was sung by 300 warm, young male voices. With a courtesy full of grandeur, the governor stood up at the first notes of our national hymn. The whole house was on its feet in a second, and the magnificent anthem echoed in our hearts like a call from the mother country. I do not believe I ever heard the Marseillaise sung with keener emotion and unanimity. As soon as it was over, the plaudits of the crowd broke out 3 times over. Then, upon a sharp gesture from the governor, the band played God Save the Queen. I never saw a prouder and more dignified gesture than that of the governor when he motioned to the leader of the band. He was quite willing to allow these sons of submissive Frenchmen to feel a regret, perhaps even a flickering hope. The first on his feet, he listened to that fine plaint with respect, but he smothered its last echo beneath the English national anthem. Being English, he was incontestably right in doing so. I gave for the last performance on the 25th December, Christmas Day, Hernani. The Bishop of Montreal again thundered against me, against Scribe and Legouve, and the poor artistes who had come with me who could not help it. I do not know whether he did not even threaten to excommunicate all of us, living and dead. Lovers of France and French art, in order to reply to his abusive attack, unyoked my horses, and my sleigh was almost carried by an immense crowd, among which were the deputies and notabilities of the city. One has only to consult the daily papers of that period to realize the crushing effect caused by such a triumphant return to my hotel. The day following, Sunday, I left the hotel at 7 o'clock in the morning with Jarrett and my sister for a promenade on the banks of the St. Lawrence River. At a given moment, I ordered the carriage to stop with the object of walking a little way. My sister laughingly said, "What if we climb onto the large piece of ice that seems ready to crack?" No sooner thought of than done. And behold, both of us walking on the ice, trying to break it loose. All of a sudden, a loud shout from Jarrett made us understand that we had succeeded. As a matter of fact, our ice bark was already floating free in the narrow channel of the river that remained always open through the force of the current. My sister and I sat down, for the piece of ice rocked about in every direction, making both of us laugh inordinately. Jarrett's cries caused people to gather. Men armed with boat hooks endeavored to stop our progress, but it was not easy, for the edges of the channel were too friable to bear the weight of a man. Ropes were thrown out to us. We caught hold of one of them with our 4 hands, but the sudden pull of the men in drawing us toward them cast our raft so suddenly against the icy edges that it broke in two, and we remained, full of fear this time, on one small part of our skiff. I laughed no longer, for we were beginning to travel somewhat fast, and the channel was opening out in width. But in one of the turns it made, we were unfortunately squeezed in between 2 immense blocks, and to this fact we owed being able to escape with our lives. The men who had followed our very rapid ride with real courage climbed onto the blocks. A harpoon was thrown with marvelous skill onto our icy wreck so as to retain us in our position, for the current, rather strong underneath, might have caused us to move. A ladder was brought and planted against one of the large blocks, and its steps afforded us means of delivery. My sister was the first to climb up, and I followed, somewhat ashamed at our ridiculous escapade. During the length of time required to regain the bank, the carriage, with Jarrett in it, was able to rejoin us. He was pallid, not from fear of the danger I had undergone, but at the idea that if I died, the tour would come to an end. He said to me quite seriously, "If you had lost your life, madam, you would have been dishonest, for you would have broken your contract of your own free will." We had just enough time to get to the station, where the train was ready to take me to Springfield. An immense crowd was waiting, and it was with the same cry of love, underlined with au revoir, that the Canadian public wished us goodbye. End of section 28.
Section 29 of Memories of My Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My tour of the Western States. After our immense and noisy success at Montreal, we were somewhat surprised with the icy welcome of the public at Springfield. We played La Dame au Camelet, in America, Camille. Why? No one was ever able to tell me. This play, that the public rushed to see in crowds, shocked the overstrained Puritanism of the small American states. The critics of the large cities discussed this modern Magdalene, but those of the small towns began by throwing stones at her. This stilted reserve on the part of the public, prejudiced against the impurity of Marguerite Gautier, we met with from time to time in the small cities. Springfield at that time had barely 30,000 inhabitants. During the day I passed at Springfield, I called at a gunsmith to purchase a Colt gun. The salesman showed me into a long and very narrow courtyard, where I tried several guns. On turning round, I was surprised and confused to see 2 gentlemen taking an interest in my shooting. I wished to withdraw at once, but one of them came up to me. "Would you like, madame, to come and fire off a cannon?" I almost fell to the ground with surprise, and did not reply for a second. Then I said, "Yes, I would." An appointment was made with my strange questioner, who was the director of the Colt gun factory. An hour afterwards, I went to the rendezvous. More than 30 people were there already, who had been hastily invited. It got on my nerves a trifle. I fired off the newly invented, quick-firing cannon. It amused me very much without procuring me any emotion, and that evening, after an icy performance, we left for Baltimore with a vertiginous rush, the play having finished later than the hour fixed for the departure of the train. It was necessary to catch it at any cost. The 3 enormous carriages that made up my special train went off under full steam. Having 2 engines, we bounded over the rails, but stayed on, thanks to some miracle. We finally succeeded in catching up with the express that, having been warned by telegram, knew we were on its track. It made a short stop, just long enough to couple us to it. And in that day we reached Baltimore, where I stayed 4 days and gave 5 performances. 2 things struck me in that city: the deadly cold in the hotels and the theater, and the loveliness of the women. I felt a profound sadness at Baltimore, for it was the first time I had spent the 1st of January far from everything that was dear to me. I wept all night and underwent that moment of discouragement that makes one wish for death. The success, however, had been colossal in that charming city, which I left with regret to go to Philadelphia, where we were to remain a week. That handsome city I do not care for. I received an enthusiastic welcome there, in spite of a change of program the first evening. 2 artists having missed the train, we could not play Adrienne Lecouvreur, and I had to replace it by Phèdre, the only piece in which the absentees could be replaced. The receipts averaged 20,000 francs for the 7 performances given in 6 days. My sojourn was saddened by a letter announcing the death of my friend Gustave Flaubert, the writer who had the beauty of our language most at heart. From Philadelphia, we proceeded to Chicago. At the station, I was received by a deputation of Chicago ladies, and a bouquet of rare flowers was handed to me by a delightful young lady, Madame Lily. Jarrett then led me into one of the rooms of the station where the French delegates were waiting. A very short but highly emotional speech from our counsel spread confidence and friendly feelings among all, and after having returned a heartfelt thanks, I was preparing to leave the station when I remained stupefied, and it seemed that my features assumed such an intense expression of suffering that everybody ran toward me to offer assistance. For a sudden anger electrified all my being, and I walked straight toward the horrible vision that had just appeared before me, the whaleman. He was alive, that horrible Smith, enveloped in furs, with diamonds on all of his fingers. He was there with a bouquet in his hand, the horrible brute. I refused the flowers, and repulsed him with all my strength increased tenfold by anger, and a flood of confused words escaped my pallid lips. But this scene charmed him, for it was repeated and spread about, magnified, and the whale had more visitors than ever. I went to the Palmer House, one of the most magnificent hotels of the day, whose proprietor, Mr. Palmer, was a perfect gentleman, courteous, kind, and generous, for he filled the immense apartment I occupied with the rarest flowers, and taxed his ingenuity in order to have me served in the French style, a rare thing at the time. We were to remain a fortnight in Chicago. Our success exceeded all expectations. This fortnight at Chicago seemed to me the most agreeable days I'd had since my arrival in America. First of all, there was the vitality of the city, in which men pass each other without ever stopping, with knitted brows, with one thought in mind: the end to attain. They move on, never turning for a cry or prudent warning. What takes place behind them matters little. They do not wish to know why a cry was raised, and they have no time to be prudent. The end to attain awaits them. Women here, as in everywhere else in America, do not work. But they do not stroll about the streets as in other cities. They walk quickly. They are also in a hurry to seek amusement. During the daytime, I went some distance into the surrounding country in order not to meet the sandwich men advertising the whale. One day, I went to the pig slaughtering house. Ah, what a dreadful and magnificent sight! There were 3 of us, my sister, myself, and an Englishman friend of mine. On arrival, we saw hundreds of pigs hurrying, bunched together, grunting and snorting, file off a small, narrow, raised bridge. Our carriage passed under this bridge and stopped before a group of men who were waiting for us. The manager of the stockyards received us and led the way to the special slaughterhouses. On entering into the immense shed, which was dimly lighted by windows with greasy and ruddy panes, an abominable smell gets into one's throat, a smell that only leaves one several days afterwards. A sanguinary mist rises everywhere like a light cloud floating on the side of a mountain and lit up by the setting sun. An infernal hubbub drums itself into one's brain. The almost human cries of the pigs being slaughtered, the violent strokes of the hatchets lopping off the limbs, the successive "hon" of the ripper who, with a superbly sweeping gesture, lifts the heavy hatchet and with one stroke opens from top to bottom the unfortunate quivering animal hung on a hook. During the terror of the moment, one hears the continuous grating of the revolving razor, which in 1 second removes the bristles from the trunk thrown to it by the machine that has cut off the 4 legs. The whistle by which escapes the steam from the hot water in which the head of the animal is scalded, the rippling of the water that is constantly renewed, the cascade of the waste water, the rumbling of the small trains carrying under wide arches trucks loaded with hams, sausages, etc. All that, sustained by the sounds of the bells of the engines warning of the danger of their approach, and which, in this spot of terrible massacre, seemed to be the perpetual knell of wretched agonies. Nothing was more Hoffmannesque than this slaughter of pigs at the period I am speaking about, for since then a sentiment of humanity has crept, although still somewhat timidly, into this temple of porcine hecatombs. I returned from this visit quite ill. That evening I played in Phaedra. I went onto the stage quite unnerved and trying to do everything to get rid of the horrible vision of a little while ago. I threw myself heart and brain into my role, so much so that at the end of the 4th act I absolutely fainted on the stage. On the day of my last performance, a magnificent collar of camellias in diamonds was handed me on behalf of the ladies of Chicago. I left that city fond of everything in it, its people, its lake as big as a small inland sea, its audiences who were so enthusiastic, everything but its stockyards. I did not even bear any ill will toward the bishop who also, as had happened in other cities, had denounced my art and French literature. By the violence of his sermons, as he had as a matter of fact advertised us so well, that Mr. Abbey, the manager, wrote the following letter to him. His Grace, whenever I visit your city, I am accustomed to spend $400 in advertising. But, as you have done the advertising for me, I send you $200 for your poor. Henry Abbey. We left Chicago to go to St. Louis, where we arrived after having covered 283 miles in 14 hours. In the drawing room of the car, Abby and Jarrett showed me the statement of the 62 performances that had been given since our departure. The gross receipts were $227,459, that is to say 1,137,295 francs, an average of 18,343 francs per performance. This gave me great pleasure on Henry Abbott's account, who had lost everything in his previous tour with an admirable troupe of opera artistes, and greater pleasure still on my own account, for I was to receive a good share of those receipts. We stayed in St. Louis all week, from the 24th to the 31st of January. I must admit that this city, which was specially French, was less to my liking than the other American cities, as it was dirty and the hotels were not very comfortable. Since then, St. Louis has made great strides, but it was the Germans who planted there the bulb of progress. At the time of which I speak, the year was 1881. The city was repulsively dirty. In those days, alas, we were not great at colonizing, and all the cities where French influence preponderated were poor and behind the times. I was bored to death at St. Louis, and I wanted to leave the place at once, after paying the indemnity to the manager Jarrett, the upright man, the stern man of duty, the ferocious man, said to me, holding the contract in his hand, "No, madame, you must stay. You can die of ennui here if you like, but stay you must." By way of entertaining me, he took me to a celebrated grotto, where we were to see some millions of fish without eyes. The light had never penetrated into this grotto, and as the first fish who lived there had no use for their eyes, their descendants had no eyes at all. We went down and groped our way to the grotto, very cautiously, on all fours, like cats. The road seemed to me interminable, but at last the guide told us that we had arrived at our destination. We were able to stand upright again, as the grotto itself was higher. I could see nothing, but I heard a match being struck, and the guide then lighted a small lantern. Just in front of me, nearly at my feet, was a rather deep natural basin. "You see," remarked our guide phlegmatically, "that is the pond, but just at present there's no water in it. Neither are there any fish. You must come again in 3 months' time." Jarrett made such a fearful grimace that I was seized with an uncontrollable fit of laughter, of that kind of laughter which borders on madness. I was suffocated with it, and I hiccuped and laughed till the tears came. I then went down into the basin of the pond in search of a relic of some kind, a little skeleton of a dead fish, or anything no matter what. There was nothing to be found, though, absolutely nothing. We had to return on all fours as we came. I made Jarrett go first, and the sight of his big back in his fur coat as he walked along on hands and feet, grumbling and swearing as he went, gave me such delight that I no longer regretted anything, and I gave $10 to the guide, to his ineffable surprise. Library in Madame Bernhardt's house, Paris. We returned to the hotel, and I was informed that a jeweler had been waiting for me more than 2 hours. "A jeweler?" I exclaimed. "But I have no intention of buying any jewelry. I have too much as it is." Jarrett, however, winked at Abby, who was there as we entered. I saw at once there was some understanding between the jeweler and my 2 impresarii. I was told that my ornaments needed cleaning, that the jeweler would undertake to make them look like new, repair them if they required it, and, in a word, exhibit them. I rebelled, but it was of no use. Jarrett assured me that the ladies of St. Louis were particularly fond of shows of this kind. He said it would be an excellent advertisement, that my jewelry was very much tarnished, and several stones were missing, and that this man would replace them for nothing. "What a saving!" he added. "Just think of it." I gave up, for discussions of that kind bore me to death, and 2 days later the ladies of St. Louis went to admire my ornaments in this jeweler's showcases under the blaze of light. Poor Madame Gerard, who also wanted to see them, came back horrified. "They have added to your things," she said, 16 pairs of earrings, 2 necklaces, and 30 rings, a lorgnette all diamonds and rubies, a gold cigarette holder set with turquoises, a small pipe, the amber mouthpiece of which is encircled with diamond stars, 16 bracelets, a toothpick studded with sapphires, and a pair of spectacles with gold mounts ending with small acorns of pearls. "They must have been made specially," said poor Gerard, "for there can't be anyone who would wear such glasses," and on them were written the words, "Spectacles which Madame Sarah Bernhardt wears when she is at home." I certainly thought this was exceeding all the limits allowed to advertisement. To make me smoke pipes and wear spectacles was going rather too far, and I got into my carriage and drove at once to the jeweler's. I arrived just in time to find the place closed. It was 5 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, the lights were out, and everything was dark and silent. I returned to the hotel and spoke to Jarrett of my annoyance. "Why does it all matter, madame?" he said tranquilly. "So many girls wear spectacles, and as to the pipe, the jeweler tells me he has received 5 orders from it, and that is going to be quite the fashion. Anyhow, it is of no use worrying about the matter, as the exhibition is over now. Your jewelry will be returned tonight, and we will leave here day after tomorrow." That evening, the jeweler returned all the objects I had lent him, and they had been polished and repaired so that they looked quite new. He had included with them a gold cigarette holder set with turquoises, the very one that had been on view. I simply could not make that man understand anything, and my anger cooled down when confronted by his pleasant manner and his joy. This advertisement, though, came very near costing my life. Tempted by the thought of this huge quantity of jewelry, the greater part of which did not belong to me, a little band of sharpers planned to rob me, believing that they would find all these valuables in the large handbag which my steward always carried. On Sunday, the 30th of January, we left St. Louis at 8 o'clock in the morning for Cincinnati. I was in my magnificently appointed Pullman car, and I had requested that my car should be put at the end of our special train, so that from the platform I might enjoy the beauty of the landscape which passes before one like a continually changing living panorama. We had scarcely been more than 10 minutes en route when the guard suddenly stooped down and looked over the little balcony. He then drew back quickly, and his face turned pale. Seizing my hand, he said in a very anxious tone in English, "Please go inside, madame." I understood that we were in danger of some kind. He pulled the alarm signal and made a sign to another guard, and before the train had quite come to a standstill, the two men sprang down and disappeared under the train. The guard had fired a revolver in order to attract everyone's attention, and Jarrett, Abby, and the artiste hurried out of the narrow corridor. I found myself in the midst of them, and to our stupefaction, we saw two guards dragging out from underneath my compartment a man armed to the teeth with a revolver held to his temple on either side. He decided to confess the truth of the matter. The jeweler's exhibition had excited the envy of all the tribes of thieves, and this man had been dispatched by an organized hand at St. Louis to relieve me of my jewelry. He was to unhook my carriage from the rest of the train between St. Louis and Cincinnati at a certain spot known as the Little Incline. As this was to be done during the night, and my carriage was the last, the thing was comparatively easy, as it was only a question of lifting the enormous hook and drawing it out of the link. The man was a veritable giant, and he was fastened onto my carriage. We examined his apparatus and found that it consisted of merely very thick, wide straps of leather, about half a yard wide. By means of these, he was fastened firmly to the under part of the train, with his hands perfectly free. The courage and the sang-froid of that man were admirable. He told us that 7 armed men were waiting for us at the Little Incline, and that they certainly would not have injured us if we had not attempted to resist, for all they wanted was my jewelry and the money which the secretary carried, $2,300. Oh, he knew everything. He knew everyone's name, and he gabbled on in bad French. Oh, as for you, madame, we should not have done you any harm in spite of your pretty little revolver. We should have even let you keep it. And so, this man and his band knew that the secretary slept at my end of the train, and that he was not to be dreaded much, poor Chatterton, that he had with him $2,300, and that I had a prettily chased revolver ornamented with cat's eyes. This man was firmly bound and taken in charge by the 2 guards, and the train was then backed to St. Louis. We had started away only a quarter of an hour before. The police were informed, and they sent us 5 detectives. A goods train, which should have gone on half an hour after us, was sent on ahead. 8 detectives traveled on this goods train and received orders to get out at the Little Incline. Our giant was handed over to the police authorities, but I was promised that he should be dealt with mercifully on account of the confession that he had made. Later on, I learned that this promise had been kept, and the man was sent back to his native country, Ireland. From this time forth, my compartment was always placed between 2 others every night. In the daytime, I was allowed to have my carriage at the end on the condition that I would agree to have an armed detective on my bridge, whom I was to pay, by the way, for his services. We started about 25 minutes after the goods train. All the men were requested to have their revolvers in readiness, and some weight sticks like pastry rollers were given to the women and to the men who had not any revolvers. Our dinner was very gay, and everyone was rather excited. As to the guard who had discovered the giant hidden under the train, Abby and I had rewarded him so lavishly that he was intoxicated and kept coming on every occasion to kiss my hand and weep his drunkard's tears, repeating all the time, "I saved the French lady. I'm a gentleman." When finally we approached the little incline, it was dark. The engine driver wanted to rush along at full speed, but we had not gone 5 miles when the petards exploded under the wheels, and we were obliged to slacken our pace. We wondered what new danger there was awaiting us, and we began to feel anxious. The women were nervous, and some of them were in tears. We went along slowly, peering into the darkness, trying to make out the form of a man or several men by the light of each petard. Abby suggested going at full speed because these petards had been placed along the line by the bandits, who had probably thought of some way of stopping the train in case their giant did not succeed in unhooking our carriage. The engine driver refused to go more quickly, declaring that these petards were the signals placed there by the railway company, and that he could not risk everyone's life on a mere supposition. The man was quite right, and he was certainly very brave. "We can certainly settle a handful of ruffians," he said, "but I could not answer for anyone's life if the train went off the lines, or collided with something, or went over a precipice." We continued, therefore, to go slowly. The lights had been turned off in the car, so that we might see as much as possible without being seen ourselves. We had tried to keep the truth from the artistes, except from 3 men whom I had sent to come to my carriage. The artistes really had nothing to fear from the robbers, as I was the only person at whom they were aiming. To avoid all unnecessary questions and evasive answers, we sent the secretary to tell them, as there was some obstruction on the line, that the train had to go slowly. They were also told that one of the gas pipes had to be repaired before we could have the light again. The communication was then cut between my car and the rest of the train. We had been going along like this for 10 minutes perhaps, when everything was suddenly lighted up by a fire, and we saw a gang of railwaymen hastening toward us. It makes me shudder now, when I think how nearly these poor fellows were to be killed. Our nerves had been in such a state of tension for several hours that we imagined at first that these men were the wretched friends of the giant. Someone fired at them, and if it had not been for our plucky engine driver calling out to them to stop, with the addition of a terrible oath, 2 or 3 of these poor men would have been wounded. I, too, had seized my revolver, but before I could have drawn out the ramrod, which serves as a cog to prevent it from going off, anyone would have had time to seize me, blind me, and kill me 100 times over. And still, any time I go to a place where I think there is danger, I invariably take my pistol with me, for it is a pistol and not a revolver. I always call it a revolver, but in reality, it is a pistol, and of a very old-fashioned make, too, with this ramrod and the trigger so hard to pull that I have to use my other hand as well. I am not a bad shot, for a woman, provided that I may take my time. But this is not very easy when one wants to fire at a robber, and yet I always have my pistol with me. It is here on my table, and I can see it as I write. It is in its case, which is rather too narrow, so that it requires a certain amount of strength and patience to pull it out. If an assassin should arrive at this particular moment, I should first have to unfasten the case, which is no easy matter, then to get the pistol out, pull out the ramrod, which is rather too firm, and press the trigger with both hands. And yet, in spite of all of this, the human animal is so strange that this ridiculously useless object here before me seems to be an admirable protection. And nervous and timid as I am, alas, I feel quite safe when I am near to this little friend of mine, who must roar with laughter inside the little case, out of which I can scarcely drag it. Well, everything now was explained to us. The goods train, which had started before us, ran off the line, but no great damage was done, and no one was killed. The St. Louis band of robbers had arranged everything and had prepared to have this little accident 2 miles from the little incline in case their comrade, crouching under my car, had not been able to unhook it. The train left the rails, but when the wretches rushed forward, believing that it was mine, they found themselves surrounded by the band of detectives. It seems like they fought like demons. One of them was killed on the spot, 2 more wounded, and all the others taken prisoners. A few days later, the chief of this little band was hanged. He was a Belgian named Albert Weerbin, 25 years of age. I did all in my power to save him, for it seemed to me that unintentionally I had been the instigator of his evil plan. If Abby and Jarrett had not been so rabid for advertisement, if they had not added more than 600,000 francs worth of jewelry to mine, this man, this wretched youth, would not perhaps have had the stupid idea of robbing me. Corner in Sarah Bernhardt's library, showing Madame Bernhardt's writing table on the left. Who can say what schemes had floated through the minds of the poor fellow, who was perhaps half-starved, or perhaps excited by a clever, inventive brain? Perhaps when he stopped and looked in the jeweler's windows, he said to himself, "There is jewelry there worth 1,000,000 francs. If it were all mine, I would sell it and go back to Belgium. What joy I could give to my poor mother, who is blinding herself with work by gaslight. And I could help my sister to get married." Or perhaps he was an inventor, and he thought to himself, "Ah, if only I had the money which that jewelry represents, I could bring out my invention myself instead of selling my patent to some highly esteemed rascal who will buy it from me for a crust of bread. What would it matter to the artiste? Ah, if only I had the money. Ah, if I had the money." Perhaps the poor fellow cried with rage to think all of this wealth belonging to one person. Perhaps the idea of crime germinated in this way in a mind which hitherto had been pure. End of section 29. Read by KimberlyB. Section 30 of Memories of My Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the Gulf to Canada again. We arrived at Cincinnati safe and sound. We gave 3 performances there and set off once more for New Orleans. Now I thought, we shall have some sunshine, and we shall be able to warm our poor limbs, stiffened with 3 months of mortal cold. We shall be able to open our windows and breathe fresh air instead of the suffocating and anemia-giving steam heat. I fell asleep, and dreams of warmth and sweet scents lulled me in my slumber. A knock at my door roused me suddenly, and my dog, with ears erect, sniffed at the door. But as he did not growl, I knew it was someone of our party. I opened the door, and Jarrett, followed by Abby, made signs to me not to speak. Jarrett came in on tiptoes and closed the door again. "Well, what is it now?" I asked. "Why," replied Jarrett, "the incessant rain during the last 12 days has swollen the river to such a height that the bridge across the Bay of St. Louis threatens to give way. If we go back, we shall require 3 or 4 days." I was furious. 3 or 4 days? And to go back to the snow again? Ah, no. I felt I must have sunshine. "Why can we not pass? Oh, heavens, what shall we do?" I exclaimed. "Well, the engine driver is here. He thinks that he might get across, but he has only just married, and he will try the crossing on condition that you give him $2,500, which he will at once send to Mobile, where his father and wife live. If we get safely to the other side, he will give you back this money, but if not, it will belong to his family." "Yes, certainly. Give him the money and let us cross." As I have said, I generally traveled by special train. This one was made up of only 3 carriages and the engine. I never doubted for a moment as to the success of this foolish and criminal attempt, but I did not tell anyone about it except my sister, my beloved Gerard, my faithful Félicie, and her husband Claude. The comedian Angelo, who was sleeping in Jared's berth on this journey, knew of it, but he was courageous and had faith in his star. The money was handed over to the engine driver, who sent it off to Mobile. It was only just as we were actually starting that I had the vision of the responsibility I had taken upon myself, for it was risking, without their consent, the lives of 27 persons. It was too late then to do anything. The train had started, and at a terrific speed, it touched the bridge. I had taken my seat on the platform, and the bridge bent and swayed like a hammock under the dizzy speed of our wild course. When we were halfway across, it gave way so much that my sister grasped my arm and whispered, "Ah, are we drowning?" I certainly thought as she did, that the supreme moment had arrived. My last minute was not inscribed, though, for that day in the book of destiny. The train pulled itself together, and we arrived on the other side of the water. Behind us, we heard a terrible noise. The bridge had given way. For more than a week, the trains from the east and the north could not enter the city. I left the money to our brave engine driver, but my conscience was by no means tranquil, and for a long time my sleep was disturbed by the most frightful nightmares. When getting out of the train, I was more dead than alive. I had to submit to receiving the friendly but fatiguing deputation of my compatriots. Then, loaded with flowers, I climbed into the carriage that was to take me to the hotel. The roads were rivers, and we were on an elevated spot. The lower part of the city, the coachman explained to us in Marseille French, was inundated up to the tops of the houses. The Negroes had been drowned by hundreds. "Ah, hussy!" he cried, as he whipped up his horses. At that period, the hotels in New Orleans were squalid, dirty, uncomfortable, black with cockroaches, and as soon as the candles were lighted, the bedrooms became filled with large mosquitoes that buzzed around and fell on one's shoulders, sticking in one's hair. Oh, I shudder still when I think of it. At the same time, there was an opera company in the city, the star of which was a charming woman, Emily Ambre, who at one time came very near being Queen of Holland. The country was poor, like all the other American districts, where the French were found preponderating. Ah, we are hardly good colonists. The opera did a very poor business, and we did not do excellently either. 6 performances would have been ample in that city. We gave 8. Nevertheless, my sojourn pleased me immensely. An infinite charm was evolved from it. All these people, so different, black and white, had smiling faces. All the women were graceful. The shops were attractive from the cheerfulness of their windows. The open-air traders under the arcades challenged one another with joyful flashes of wit. The sun, however, did not show itself once, but these people had sun within themselves. I could not understand why boats were not used. The horses had water up to their hams, and it would have been impossible even to get into a carriage if the pavements had not been a meter or more high. Floods being as frequent as the years, it would be of no use thinking of banking up the river or arm of the sea. But walking was made easy by high pavements and small movable bridges. The dark children amused themselves catching crayfish in the streams. Where did they come from? And they sold them to passer-by. Now and again, we would see a whole family of water serpents speed by. They swept along with raised head and undulating body like long, starry sapphires. I went down toward the lower part of the town. The sight was heart-rendering. All the cabins of the colored inhabitants had fallen into the muddy waters. They were there in hundreds, squatting upon these moving wrecks, with eyes burning from fever, their white teeth chattering. Right and left, everywhere, were dead bodies floating about, knocking up against the wooden piles. Many ladies were distributing food, endeavoring to lead away the unfortunate Negroes, but they refused to go, and the women would slowly shake their heads. One child of 14 years of age had just been carried off to the hospital with his foot cut clean off at the ankle by an alligator. His family were howling with fury. They wished to keep the youngster with them. The Negro quack doctor pretended that he could have cured him in 2 days, and that the white quacks would leave him for a month in bed. I left the city with regret, for it resembled no other city I had visited up to then. We were surprised to find that none of our party was missing, though we had gone through, so they all said, various dangers. The hairdresser alone, a man called eBay, could not recover his equilibrium, having become half mad from fear the second day of our arrival. At the theater, he generally slept in the trunk in which he stored his wigs. However strange that may seem, the fact is quite true. The first night, everything passed off as usual, but during the second night, he woke up the whole neighborhood by his shrieks. The unfortunate fellow had got off soundly to sleep when he woke up with a feeling that his mattress, which hung over his collection of wigs, was being raised up by some unconceivable movements. He thought that some cat or dog had got into the trunk, and he lifted up the feeble rampart. 2 serpents were within, actively moving about, of a size sufficient to terrify the people that the shouts of the poor Figaro had caused to gather round. He was still very pale when I saw him embark on board the boat that was to take us to our train. I called him and begged him to relate to me the odyssey of his terrible night. As he told me the story, he showed me his heavy leg. "They were as thick as that, madame. Yes, like that." And he quaked with fear as he recalled the dreadful girth of the reptiles. I thought that they were about 1/4 as thick as his leg, and that would have been enough to justify his fright. But the serpents in question were inoffensive water snakes that bite out of pure viciousness, but have no venom fangs. We reached Mobile somewhat late in the day. We had stopped at that city on our way to New Orleans, and I had a real attack of nerves caused by the cheek of the inhabitants who, in spite of the lateness of the hour, had got up a deputation to wait upon me. I was dead with fatigue, and was dropping off to sleep in my bed on the car. I therefore energetically declined to see anybody. But these people knocked at my windows, sang about my carriage, and finally exasperated me. I quickly threw up one of the windows and emptied a jug of water on their heads. Women and men, among whom were several journalists, were splashed. Their fury was great. I was returning to that city, preceded by the above story embellished in their favor by the drenched reporters. But on the other hand, there were others who had been more courteous and had refused to go and disturb a lady at such an unearthly hour of the night. These latter were in the majority and took up my defense. It was therefore in this warlike atmosphere that I appeared before the public of Mobile. I wanted, however, to justify the good opinion of my defenders and confound my detractors. Yes, but the gnome who had decided otherwise was there. Mobile was a city that was generally quite disdained by impresarii. There was only one theater. It had been let to the tragedian Barrett, who was to appear 6 days after me. All that remained was a miserable place, so small that I know of nothing that can be compared to it. We were playing La Dame aux Camélias when Marguerite Gautier orders supper to be served. The servants, who were to bring in the table, ready laid, tried to get it through the door. But this was impossible. Nothing could be more comical than to see those unfortunate servants adopt every expedient. The public laughed. Among the laughter of the spectators was one that became contagious. A Negro of 12 or 15, who had got in somehow, was standing on a chair, and with his 2 hands holding on to his knees, his body bent, head forward, mouth open, he was laughing with such a shrill and piercing tone, and with such even continuity, that I caught it too. I had to go out while a portion of the back scenery was being removed to allow the table to be brought in. I returned somewhat composed, but still under the domination of suppressed laughter. We were sitting round the table, and the supper was drawing to a close as usual. But just as the servants were entering to remove the table, One of them caught the scenery that had been badly adjusted by the scene shifters in their haste, and the whole back scene fell on our heads. As the scenery was nearly all made of paper in those days, it did not fall on our heads and remain there, but round our necks, and we had to remain in that position without being able to move. Our heads having gone through the paper, our appearance was most comical and ridiculous. The young Negro's laughter started again, more piercing than ever, and this time my suppressed laughter ended in a crisis that left me without any strength. The money paid for admission was returned to the public. It exceeded 15,000 francs. This city had a fatality for me, and came very near proving so during the third visit I paid to it. That very night, we left Mobile for Atlanta, where, after playing La Dame au Camelier, we left again the same evening for Nashville. We stayed an entire day at Memphis and gave 2 performances. At 1 in the morning, we left for Louisville. We were beginning the dizzy round of smaller towns, arriving at 3, 4, and sometimes 6 o'clock in the evening, and leaving immediately after the play. I left my car only to go to the theater and returned as soon as the play was over to retire in my elegant but diminutive bedroom. I slept well on the railway. I felt an immense pleasure in traveling that way at high speed, sitting outside on the small platform, or rather reclining in a rocking chair, gazing on the ever-changing spectacle that passed before me of American plains and forests. Without stopping, we went through Louisville, Cincinnati, for the second time Columbus, Dayton, Indianapolis, St. Joseph, that has the best beer in the world, and where we were obliged to go to a hotel on account of repairs to one of the wheels of the car. Supper was served. What a supper! Fortunately, the beer was light in both color and consistency, and enabled me to swallow the dreadful things that were served up. We left for Leavenworth, Quincy, Springfield, not the Springfield in Massachusetts, the one in Illinois. During the journey from Springfield to Chicago, we were stopped by the snow in the middle of the night. The sharp and deep groanings of the locomotive had already awakened me. I summoned my faithful Claude and learned that we were to stop and wait for help. Aided by my Félicie, I dressed in haste and tried to descend, but it was impossible. The snow was as high as the platform of the car. I remained wrapped up in furs, contemplating the magnificent night. The sky was hard, implacable, without a star, but all the same translucent. Lights extended as far as the eye could see along the rails before me, for I had taken refuge on the rear platform. These lights were to warn the trains that followed. 4 of them came up and stopped when the first fog signals went off beneath their wheels, then crept slowly forward to the first light, where a man who was stationed there explained the incident. The same lights were lit immediately for the following train, as far off as possible, and a man proceeding beyond the lights placed detonators on the rails. Each train that arrived followed that course. We were blocked by the snow. The idea came to me of lighting the kitchen fire, and I thus got enough boiling water to melt the top coating of snow on the side where I wanted to get down. Having done this, Claude and the Negroes got down and cleared away a small portion as well as they could. I was at last able to get down myself and tried to remove the snow to one side. My sister and I finished by throwing snowballs at each other, and the melee became general. Abby, Jarrett, the secretary, and several of the artistes joined in, and we were warmed through this small battle with white cannonballs. When dawn appeared, we were to be seen firing a revolver and Colt rifle at a target made from a champagne case. A distant sound, deadened by the cotton wool of the snow, at length made us realize that help was approaching. As a matter of fact, 2 engines with men who had shovels, hooks, and spades were coming at full speed from the opposite direction. They were obliged to slow down on getting to 1 kilometer of where we were, and the men got down, clearing the way before them. They finally succeeded in reaching us, but we were obliged to go back and take the western route. The unfortunate artistes who had counted on getting breakfast in Chicago, which we ought to have reached at 11 o'clock, were lamenting, for with the new itinerary that we were forced to follow, it would be 1:30 before we could get to Milwaukee, where we were to give a matinee at 2 o'clock, La Dame aux Camélias. I therefore had the best lunch I could prepared, and my Negroes carried it to my company, the members of which showed themselves very grateful. The performance did not begin till 3 and finished at 6:30 o'clock. We started again at 8 with Frou-Frou. Immediately after the play was over, we left for Grand Rapids, Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh, in which latter city I was to meet an American friend of mine who was to help me to realize one of my dreams. At least, I fancied so. In partnership with his brother, my friend was the owner of a large steelworks with several petroleum wells. I had known him in Paris and had met him again at New York, where he offered to conduct me to Buffalo so that I could visit, or rather, where he could show me the falls of Niagara, for which he entertained a lover's passion. Frequently, he would start off quite unexpectedly, like a madman, and take a rest at a place just near Niagara Falls. The deafening sound of the cataracts seemed like music after the hard, hammering, strident noise of the forges at work on the iron, and the limpidity of the silvery cascades rested his eyes and refreshed his lungs, saturated as they were with petroleum and smoke. My friend's buggy, drawn by 2 magnificent horses, took us along in a bewildering whirlwind of mud splashing over us and snow blinding us. It had been raining for a week, and Pittsburgh in 1881 was not what it is at present, although it was a city which impressed one on account of its commercial genius. The black mud ran along the streets, and everywhere in the sky rose huge patches of thick, black, opaque smoke. But there was a certain grandeur about it all, for work was king there. Trains ran through the streets laden with barrels of petroleum, or piled as high as possible with charcoal and coal. That fine river, the Ohio, carried along with it steamers, barges, and loads of timbers fastened together and forming enormous rafts which floated down the river alone to be stopped on the way by the owner for whom they were destined. The timber is marked, and no one else thinks of taking it. I am told that the wood is not conveyed in this way now, and it is a pity. The carriage took us along through streets and squares in the midst of railways, under the enervating vibration of the electric wires, which ran like furrows across the sky. We crossed a bridge which shook under the light weight of the buggy. It was a suspension bridge. Finally, we drew up at my friend's house. He introduced his brother to me, a charming man, but very cold and correct, so quiet that I was astonished. Theatre Sarah Bernhardt, Paris. "My poor brother is deaf," said my companion, after I had been exerting myself for 5 minutes to talk to him in my gentlest voice. I looked at this poor millionaire, who was living in the most extraordinary noise, and could not even hear the faintest echo of the outrageous uproar. He could not even hear anything at all, and I wondered whether he was to be envied or pitied. I was then taken to visit his incandescent ovens and his vats in a state of ebullition. I went into a room where some steel discs were cooling, which looked like so many setting suns. The heat from them seemed to scorch my lungs, and I felt as though my hair would take fire. We then went down a long, narrow street, through which small trains were running to and fro. Some of those trains were laden with incandescent metals, which irised the air as they passed. We walked in single file along the narrow passage reserved for foot passengers between the rails. I did not feel at all safe, and my heart began to beat fast. Blown each way by the wind from the 2 trains coming in opposite directions and passing each other, I drew my skirts closely round me so that they should not be caught. Perched on my high heels, at every step I took, I was afraid of slipping on this narrow, greasy, coal-strewn pavement. To sum it up briefly, it was a very unpleasant moment, and very delighted I was to come to the end of that interminable street, which led to an enormous field stretching away as far as the eye could see. There were rails lying all about here, which men were polishing and filing, etc. I had had quite enough, though, and I asked to be allowed to go back and rest. So we all three returned to the house. On arriving there, valets arrayed in livery opened the doors, took our furs, walking on tiptoes as they moved about. There was silence everywhere, and I wondered why, as it seemed to me incomprehensible. My friend's brother scarcely spoke at all, and when he did, his voice was so low that I had great difficulty in understanding him. When we asked him any question by gesticulating, and we had to listen most attentively to catch his reply, I noticed that an almost imperceptible smile lighted up for an instant his stony face. I understood very soon that this man hated humanity, and that he avenged himself in his own way for his infirmity. Lunch had been prepared for us in the winter conservatory, a nook of magnificent verdure and flowers. We had not taken our seats at the table when the songs of 1,000 birds burst forth like a veritable fanfare. Underneath some large leaves, whole families of canaries were imprisoned by invisible nets. They were everywhere, up in the air, down below, under my chair, on the table behind me, all over the place. I tried to quiet this shrill uproar by shaking my napkin and speaking in a loud voice, but the little feathered tribe began to sing in a maddening way. The deaf man was leaning back in his rocking chair, and I noticed that his face had lighted up. He laughed aloud in an evil, spiteful manner. Just as my own temper was getting the better of me, a feeling of pity and indulgence came into my heart for this man, whose vengeance seemed to me as pathetic as it was puerile. Promptly deciding to make the best of my host's spitefulness, and, assisted by his brother, I took my tea into the hall at the other end of the conservatory. I was nearly dead with fatigue, and when my friend proposed that I should go with him to see his petroleum wells a few miles out of the city, I gazed at him with such a scared, hopeless expression that he begged me in the most friendly and polite way to forgive him. It was 5 o'clock and quite dusk, and I wanted to go back to my hotel. Mr. T.H. asked if I would allow him to take me back by the hills. The road was rather longer, but I should be able to have a bird's eye view of Pittsburgh, and he assured me that it was quite worthwhile. We started off in the buggy with 2 fresh horses, and a few minutes later I had the wildest dream. It seemed to me that he was Pluto, the god of infernal regions, and I was Proserpine. We were traveling through our empire at a quick trot, drawn by our winged horses. All around us we could see fire and flames. The blood-red sky was burning with long, black trails that looked like widows' veils. The ground was covered with long arms of iron, stretched heavenward in a supreme imprecation. These arms threw forth smoke, flames, or sparks, which fell again in showers of stars. The carriage carried us on up the hills, and the cold froze our limbs, while the fires excited our brain. It was then that my friend told me of his love for the Niagara Falls. He spoke of them more like a lover than an admirer, and he told me he liked to go to them alone. He said, though, that for me he would make an exception. He spoke of the rapids with such intense passion that I felt rather uneasy and began to wonder whether the man was not mad. I grew alarmed, for he was driving along over the very tops of the hills, jumping the stone heaps. I glanced at him sideways. His face was calm, but his underlip twitched slightly, and I had noticed this peculiarity with his deaf brother too. By this time I was quite nervous. The cold and the fires, this demoniacal drive, the sound of the anvil ringing out mournful chimes, which seemed to come from under the earth, and then the deep forge whistle, sounding like a desperate cry, rending the silence of the night. The chimney stacks, too, with their worn-out lungs, spitting forth their smoke with a perpetual death rattle. And the wind, which had just risen, twisting the streaks of smoke into spirals, which it sent up toward the sky, or beat down all at once onto us. Altogether, this wild dance of the natural and the combined elements affected my whole nervous system, so that it was quite time for me to get back to the hotel. I sprang out of the carriage quickly on arriving and arranged to see my friend at Buffalo, but alas, I was never to see him again. He took cold that very day and could not meet me there, and the following year I heard that he had been dashed against the rocks when tying his boat in the rapids. He died of his passion for his passion. At the hotel, all the artistes were awaiting me. As I had forgotten, we were to have a rehearsal of La Princesse Georges at 4:30. I noticed a face that was unknown to me among the members of the company, and on making inquiries about this person, found that he was an illustrator who had brought an introduction from Jarrett. He asked to be allowed to make a few sketches of me, and after giving orders that he should be taken to a seat, I did not trouble any more about him. We had to hurry through the rehearsal in order to be at the theater in time for the performance of Frou Frou, which we were giving that night. The rehearsal was accordingly rushed and gabbled through so soon that it was soon over, and the stranger took his departure, refusing to let me look at his sketches on the plea that he wanted to do them up before showing them. My joy was great the following day, when Jarrett arrived at my hotel, perfectly furious, holding in his hand the principal newspaper of Pittsburgh, in which our illustrator, who turned out to be a journalist, had written an article giving at full length an account of the dress rehearsal of Frou Frou. In the play of Frou Frou, wrote this delightful imbecile, there is only one scene of any importance, and that is one between the two sisters. Madame Sarah Bernhardt did not impress me greatly, and as to the artistes of the Comédie Française, I considered they were mediocre. The costumes were not very fine, and in the ball scene, the men did not wear dress suits. Jarrett was wild with rage, and I was wild with joy. He knew my horror of reporters, and he had introduced this one in an underhand way, hoping to get a good advertisement out of it. The journalist imagined that we were having a dress rehearsal of Frou Frou, and we were merely rehearsing Alexandre Dumas' Princesse Georges for the sake of refreshing our memories. He had mistaken the scene between the Princesse Georges and the Comtesse de Terremonde for the scene in the third act between the two sisters in Frou Frou. We were all of us wearing our traveling costumes, and he was surprised at not seeing the men in dress coats and the women in evening dress. What fun this was for our company, and for all the town, and, I may add, what a subject it furnished for the jokes of all the rival newspapers. End of section 30, read by KimberlyB. Section 31 of Memories of My Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Memories of My Life by Sarah Bernhardt. End of my American tour. I had to play 2 days at Pittsburgh, and then go on to Bradford, Erie, Toronto, and arrive at Buffalo on Sunday. It was my intention to give all the members of my company a day's entertainment at the Falls, but Abby too wanted to invite them. We had a discussion on the subject, which was extremely animated. He was very dictatorial, and so was I, and we both preferred giving the whole thing up rather than yield to each other. Jarrett, however, pointed out the fact to us that our autocracy would deprive the artistes of a little festivity about which they had heard a great deal, and to which they were looking forward. We therefore gave in finally, and in order to settle the matter, we agreed to share this fête between us. The artistes accepted our invitations with the most charming good grace, and we took the train for Buffalo, where we arrived at 10 minutes past 6 in the morning. We had telegraphed beforehand for carriages and coffee to be in readiness, and to have food provided for us, as it is simply madness for 32 persons to arrive on Sunday in an American town without giving notice of such an event. We had a special train going at full speed over the lines that were entirely free on Sundays, and it was decorated with festoons of flowers. The younger artistes were as delighted as children. Those who had already seen everything before told about it. Then there was the eloquence of those who had heard of it, etc., etc. And all this, together with the little bouquets of flowers distributed among the women, and the cigars and cigarettes presented to the men, made everyone good-humored, so that all appeared to be happy. The carriages met our train and took us to the Hôtel d'Angleterre, which had been kept open for us. There were flowers everywhere, and any number of small tables upon which were coffee, chocolate, or tea. Every table was soon surrounded with guests. I had my sister, Abby, Jarrett, and the principal artistes at my table. The meal was of short duration and very gay and animated. We then went to the falls, and I remained more than an hour on the balcony, hollowed out of the rock. My eyes filled with tears as I stood there, for I was deeply moved by the splendor of the sight. A radiant sun made the air around us iridescent. There were rainbows everywhere lighting up the atmosphere with their soft, silvery colors. The coulées of hard ice hanging down along the rocks on each side looked like enormous jewels. I was sorry to leave this balcony, and we went down in narrow cages, which glided gently into a tube arranged in the cleft of the enormous rock. We arrived in this way under the American Falls. They were there almost over our heads, sprinkling us with their blue, pink, and mauve drops. In front of us, protecting us from the falls, were a heap of icicles, forming quite a little mountain. We climbed over this to the best of our ability. My heavy fur mantle tired me, and about halfway down, I took it off and let it slip over the side of the ice mountain, to take it again when I reached the bottom. I was wearing a dress of white cloth with a satin blouse, and everyone screamed with surprise on seeing me. Abby took off his overcoat and threw it over my shoulders. I shook this off quickly, and Abby's coat went to join my fur cloak below. The poor impresario's face looked very blank. As he had taken a fair quantity of cocktails, he staggered, fell down on the ice, got up, and immediately fell again, to the amusement of everyone. I was not at all cold, as I never am when out of doors. I only feel the cold inside houses or in any place where I am inactive. Finally, we arrived at the highest point of the ice, and the cataract was really most threatening. We were covered by the impalpable mist, which rises in the midst of the tumultuous noise. I gazed at it all, bewildered and fascinated by the rapid movement of the water, which looked like a wide curtain of silver, unfolding itself to be dashed violently into a rebounding, splashing heap with a noise unlike any sound I had ever heard. I very easily turned dizzy, and I know very well that if I had been alone, I should have remained there forever. With my eye fixed on the sheet of water, hurrying along at full speed, my mind lulled by the fascinating sound, and my limbs numbed by the treacherous cold which encircled us, I had to be dragged away, but I am soon myself again when confronted by an obstacle. We had to go down again, and this was not as easy as it had been to climb up. I took the walking stick belonging to one of my friends, and then sat down on the ice. By putting the stick under my legs, I was able to slide down to the bottom. All the others imitated me, and it was a comical sight to see 40 people descending this ice hill in this way. There were several somersaults and collisions and plenty of laughter. A quarter of an hour later, we were all at the hotel, where luncheon had been ordered. We were all cold and hungry. It was warm inside the hotel, and the meal smelled good. When luncheon was over, the landlord of the hotel asked me to go into a small drawing room, where a surprise awaited me. On entering, I saw on a table, protected under a long glass box, the Niagara Falls in miniature, with the rocks looking like pebbles. A large glass represented the sheet of water, and glass threads represented the falls. Here and there was some foliage of a hard, crude green. Standing up on a little hillock of ice was a figure intended for me. It was enough to make anyone howl with horror. It was all so hideous. I managed to raise a broad smile for the benefit of the hotel keeper by way of congratulating him on his good taste. but I was petrified on recognizing the manservant of the Th brothers of Pittsburgh. They had sent this monstrous caricature of the most beautiful thing in the world. I read the letter which their domestic handed me, and all my disdain melted away. They had gone to so much trouble in order to explain what they wanted me to understand, and they were so delighted at the idea of giving me any pleasure. I dismissed the valet after giving him a letter for his masters, and I asked the hotel keeper to send the work of art to Paris packed carefully. I hoped that it might arrive in fragments. The thought of it haunted me, though, and I wondered how my friend's passion for the falls could be reconciled with the idea of such a gift, while admitting that his imaginative mind might have hoped to be able to carry out his idea. How was it that he was not indignant at the sight of this grotesque imitation? How had he dared to send it to me? How was it that my friend loved the falls? And what had he understood of their marvelous grandeur? Since his death, I have questioned my own memory of him 100 times, but all in vain. He died for them, rolling about in their waters, killed by their caresses, and I cannot think that he could have ever seen how beautiful they really were. Fortunately, I was called away, as the carriage was there, and everyone waiting for me. The horses started off with us, trotting in that weary way peculiar to tourist horses. When we arrived on the Canadian shore, we had to go underground and array ourselves in black or yellow macintoshes. We looked like so many heavy, dumpy sailors who were wearing these garments for the first time. There were 2 large cells to shelter us, one for the women and the other for the men, everyone undressed more or less in the midst of wild confusion. And making a little package of our clothes, we gave this into the keeping of the woman in charge. With a mackintosh hood drawn tightly under the chin, hiding the hair entirely, an enormous blouse, much too wide, covering the whole body, fur boots with rough soles to prevent broken legs and heads, and immense mackintosh breeches in suave style, the prettiest and slenderest woman was at once transformed into a huge, cumbersome, awkward bear. An iron-tipped cudgel to carry in the hand completed this becoming costume. I looked more ridiculous than the others, for I would not cover my hair, and in the most pretentious way I had fastened some roses into my mackintosh blouse. The women went into raptures on seeing me. "How pretty she looks like that!" they exclaimed. "She always finds a way to be chic, quand même." The men kissed my bear's paw in the most gallant way, bowing low and saying in low tones, "Always and quand même, the queen, the fairy, the goddess, the divinity," etc., etc. And I went along purring with content, and quite satisfied with myself, until, as I passed by the counter where the girl who gives the tickets was sitting, I caught sight of myself in the glass. I looked enormous and ridiculous, with my roses pinned in the curly locks of hair, forming a kind of peak to my clumsy hood. I appeared to be stouter than all the others, because of the silver belt I was wearing round my waist. As this drew up the hard folds of the mackintosh round my hips, my thin face was nearly covered by my hair, which was flattened down by my hood. My eyes could not be seen, and only my mouth, which is rather large, served to show that this barrel was a human being. Furious with myself for my pretentious coquetry, and ashamed of my own weakness for having been so content with the pitiful, insincere flattery of people who were making fun of me, I decided to remain as I was as a punishment for my stupid vanity. There were a number of strangers among us who nudged each other, pointing to me and laughing slyly at my absurd get-up, and this was only what I deserved. We went down the flight of steps cut in the block of ice in order to get underneath the Canadian Falls. The sight there was most strange and extraordinary. Above me I saw an immense cupola of ice hanging over in space, attached only on one side to the rock. From this cupola, thousands of icicles of the most varied shapes were hanging. There were dragons, arrows, crosses, laughing faces, sorrowful faces, hands with 6 fingers, deformed feet, incomplete human bodies, and women's long locks of hair. In fact, with the help of the imagination, and by fixing the gaze when looking with half-shut eyes, the illusion is complete. And in less time than it takes to describe all this, one can evoke all the pictures of nature and of our dreams, all the wild conceptions of a diseased mind, or the realities of a reflective brain. In front of us were small steeples of ice, some of them proud and erect, standing out against the sky, others ravaged by the wind, which gnaws the ice, looking like minarets, ready for the muezzin. On the right, a cascade was rushing down, as noisily as on the other side, but the sun had commenced its evolution toward the west, and everything was tinged with a rosy hue. The water splashed over us, and we were suddenly covered with small silvery waves that fell over us, and which when shaken slightly stiffened against our mackintoshes. It was a shoal of very small fish, which had the misfortune to be driven into the current, and which had come to die in the dazzling brilliancy of the setting sun. On the other side, there was a small block, which looked like a rhinoceros entering the water. "I should love to mount on that," I exclaimed. "Yes, but it is impossible," replied one of my friends. "Oh, as to that, nothing is impossible," I said. "There is only the risk the crevasse to be covered is not a yard long." "No, but it is deep," remarked an artiste who was with us. "Well," I said, "my dog is just dead. We will bet a dog of my choice that I go." Abby was fetched immediately, but he arrived only in time to see me there. I came very near falling into the crevasse, and when I was on the back of the rhinoceros, I could not stand up. It was as smooth and transparent as artificial ice. I sat down on its back, holding on to the little hump, and I declared that if no one came to fetch me, I should stay where I was, as I had not the courage to move a step on the slippery back. And then, too, it seemed to me as though it moved slightly. I began to lose my self-possession. I felt dizzy, but I had won my dog. My excitement was over, and I was seized with fright. Everyone gazed at me in a bewildered way, and that increased my terror. My sister went into hysterics, and my dear Gerard groaned in a heart-rending way, "Oh God, my dear Sarah! Oh God!" The artist was making sketches, and fortunately the company had gone on up in order to get to the rapids in time. Abby besought me to return. Poor Jared besought me, but I felt dizzy, and I could not and would not cross again. Angelo then sprang across the crevasse, and remaining there, called for a plank of wood and a hatchet. "Bravo, bravo!" I exclaimed from the back of my rhinoceros. The plank was brought. It was an old, black-looking piece of wood, and I glanced at it suspiciously. The hatchet cut into the tail of my rhinoceros, and the plank was fixed firmly by Angelo on my side, and held by Abby, Jarrett, and Claude on the other. I let myself slide over the crupper of my rhinoceros, and I then started, not without terror, along the rotten plank of wood, which was so narrow that I was obliged to put one foot in front of the other, the heel over the toe. I returned in a very feverish state to the hotel, and the artist brought me the droll sketches he had made. After a light luncheon, I was to start again by train, which had been waiting for us 20 minutes. All the others had taken their places some time before. I was leaving without having seen the rapids in which my poor Pittsburgh friend met his death. Our great voyage was drawing toward its close. I say great voyage, for it was my first one. It lasted for 8 months. The voyages I have since undertaken were always from 11 to 16 months. From Buffalo, we went to Rochester, Utica, Syracuse, Albany, Troy, Worcester, Providence, Newark, making a short stay in Washington, an admirable city, but which at that time had a sadness about it that affected one's nerves. It was the last large city I visited. After 2 admirable performances and a supper at the embassy, we left for Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, where our tour was to come to a close. In that city, I gave a grand matinee at the general demand of the artistes of New York. The piece chosen was the Princess George. Oh, what a fine and never-to-be-forgotten performance! Everything was applauded by the artistes. Nothing escaped the particular state of mind of that audience made up of actors and actresses, painters and sculptors. At the end of the play, a gold hair comb was handed to me, on which was engraved the names of a great number of persons present. From Salvini, I received a pretty casket of lapis, and from Mary Anderson, at that time in the striking beauty of her 19 years, a small medal bearing a forget-me-not in turquoise. In my dressing room, I counted 130 bouquets. That evening, we gave our last performance with La Dame aux Camélias. I had to return and bow to the public 14 times. Then I had a moment's stupefaction, for in the tempest of cries and bravos, I heard a shrill cry shouted by thousands of mouths, and which I did not in the least understand. After each recall, I asked in the wings what the meaning of the word was that struck on my ears like a dreadful sneeze, beginning again time after time. Jared appeared and enlightened me. "They are calling for a speech." I looked at him abashed. "Yes, they want you to make them a little speech." "Ah, no!" I exclaimed, as I again went on to the stage to make a bow. "No!" And in making my bow to the public, I murmured, "I cannot speak, but I can tell you thank you with all my heart." It was in the midst of a thunder of applause, underscored with "Hip, hip, hurrah! Vive la France!" that I left the theatre. On Wednesday, the 4th of May, I embarked on the same transatlantic steamer, l'Amérique, the phantom vessel to which my journey had brought good luck. But it had no longer the same commander. The new one's name was Santelli. He was as little and fair-complexioned as the other was big and dark, but he was as charming and a nice conversationalist. My cabin had been newly fitted up, and this time the woodwork had been covered in sky-blue material. On going on the steamer, I turned toward the friendly crowd and threw them a last adieu. "Au revoir," they shouted back. I then went toward my cabin. Standing at the door, in an elegant iron-gray suit, wearing pointed shoes, hat in the latest style, and wearing dog-skin gloves, stood Henry Smith, the showman of Wales. I gave a cry like that of a wild beast. He kept his joyful smile, and held out a jewel casket, which I took with the object of throwing it into the sea through the open porthole. But Jarrett caught hold of my arm and took possession of the casket, which he opened. "It is magnificent!" he exclaimed. But I had closed my eyes. I stopped up my ears and cried out to the man, "Go away, you knave, you brute! Go away! I hope you will die under atrocious suffering. Go away!" I half opened my eyes. He had gone. Jarrett wanted to talk to me about the present. I would not hear anything about it. "Ah, for God's sake, Mr. Jarrett, leave me alone. Since this jewel is so fine, give it to your daughter, and do not speak to me about it any more." And this was done. The evening before my departure from America, I had received a long cablegram, signed Grossos, President of the Life-Saving Society at Havre, asking me to give a performance for the benefit of the families of the society upon my arrival. I accepted with unspeakable joy. On regaining my native land, I should assist in drying tears. After the decks had been cleared for departure, our ship oscillated slightly, and we left New York on Thursday, the 5th of May. Detesting, as I usually do, sea traveling, I set out this time with a light heart and smiling face, disdainful of the horrible discomfort caused by the voyage. We had not left New York 48 hours when the boat stopped. I sprang out of my berth and was soon on deck, fearing some accident to our boat, Phantom, as we had nicknamed it. In front of us, a French boat had raised, lowered, and again raised its small flags. The captain, who had given the replies to these signals, sent for me and explained to me the working and the orthography of the signals. I could not remember anything he told me, I must confess to my shame. A small boat was lowered from the ship opposite us, and 2 sailors and a young man, very poorly dressed and with a pale face, embarked. Our captain had the steps lowered, the small boat accosted, and the young man, escorted by 2 sailors, came on deck. One of them handed a letter to the officer, who was waiting at the top of the steps. He read it, and looking at the young man, he said quietly, "Follow me." The small boat and the sailors returned to the ship. The boat was hoisted, the engine shrieked, and after the usual salute, the 2 ships continued their way. The unfortunate young man was brought before the captain. I went away, after asking the captain to tell me afterwards what was the meaning of it all. unless it should prove to be something which had to be kept secret. The captain came himself and told me some time after. The young man was a poor artist, a wood engraver, who had managed to slip aboard a steamer bound for New York. He had not a cent of money for his passage, as he had not even been able to pay for an immigrant's ticket. He had hoped to get through without being noticed, hiding under the bales of various kinds. He had, however, been taken ill, and it was his illness which had betrayed him. Shivering with cold and feverish, he had talked aloud in his sleep, uttering the most incoherent words. He was taken into the infirmary, and when there, he had confessed everything. The captain undertook to make him accept what I sent him for his journey to America. The story soon spread, and other passengers made a collection, so that the young engraver found himself very soon in possession of a fortune of £48. 3 days later, he brought me a little wooden box, manufactured, carved, and engraved by him. This little box is now nearly full of petals of flowers, for every year, on the 7th of May, I receive a small bouquet of flowers with these words, always the same ones, year after year: gratitude and devotion. I always put the petals of the flowers into the little box, but for the last 7 years I have not received any. Is it forgetfulness or death which has caused the artist to discontinue this graceful little token of gratitude? I have no idea, but the sight of the box always gives me a vague feeling of sadness, as forgetfulness and death are the most faithful companions of the human being. Forgetfulness takes up its abode in our mind, in our heart, while death is always here, laying traps for us, watching all we do, and jeering gaily when sleep closes our eyes, for we give him then the illusion of what he knows will someday be a reality. Apart from the above incident, nothing particular happened during the voyage. I spent every night on deck, gazing at the horizon, hoping to draw toward me the land on which were the loved ones. I turned in toward morning, and slept all day to kill the time. The boats in those days did not perform the crossing with the speed of today. The hours seemed to me to be wickedly long. I was so impatient to land that I called for the doctor and asked him to send me to sleep for 18 hours. He gave me 12 hours sleep with a strong dose of chloral, and I felt stronger and calmer for confronting the shock of happiness. Santelli had promised that we should arrive on the evening of the 14th. I was ready and had pawed the ground distractedly for an hour when an officer came to ask whether I would not go on to the bridge with the commander who was waiting for me. With my sister, I went in haste onto the bridge and soon understood from the embarrassed circumlocutions of the amiable Santelli that we were too far off to hope to make the harbor that night. I began to cry. I thought we should never arrive. I imagined that the gnome was going to triumph, and I wept those tears that were like a brook that runs on and on without ceasing. The commander did what he could to bring me to a rational state of mind. I descended from the bridge with both body and soul like limpid rags. I lay down on a straw deck chair, and when dawn came was benumbed and sleepy. It was 5 in the morning. We were still 20 miles off land. The sun, however, began joyously to brighten up the small white clouds, light as snowflakes. The look of the loved one gave me courage again. I ran toward my cabin. I spent a long while over my toilet in order to kill time. At 7 o'clock, I made inquiries from the captain. "We are 12 miles off," he said. "In 2 hours we shall land." "You swear to it?" "Yes, I swear." I returned on deck, where, leaning on the bulwark, I scanned the distance. A small steamer appeared on the horizon. I saw it without looking at it, expecting every minute to hear the cry, "Over there! Over there!" All at once I noticed masses of small white flags being waved on the small steamer. I got hold of my glass and let it fall with a joyous cry that left me without any strength, without breath. I wanted to speak. I could not. My face, it appears, became so pale that it frightened the people who were about. My sister Jean wept as she waved her arms toward the distance. They wanted to make me sit down. I would not. Hanging on to the bulwarks, I smell the salts that are thrust under my nose. I allow friendly hands to wipe my temples, but I am gazing over there whence the vessel is coming. Over there lies my happiness, my joy, my life, my everything, dearer than everything. The diamond, the vessel's name, comes near. A bridge of love is formed between the small and large ship. A bridge placed under the beatings of our hearts, under the weight of the kisses that have been kept back for how many days. Then comes the reaction that takes place in our tears when the young being that one worships is pressed to one's bosom under the spell of an undefinable emotion. The big ship is invaded. Everyone is there, my dear and faithful friends. They have accompanied my young son Maurice. Ah, what a delicious time! Answers get ahead of questions. Laughter is mingled with tears. Hands are pressed. Lips are kissed, only to begin over again. One is never tired of this repetition of tender affection. During this time our boat is moving. The diamond has disappeared, carrying away the mails. The farther we advance, the more small boats are met with, decked with flags, plowing the sea. There are 100 at least. Here are others. Is it a public holiday? I asked Georges Boyer, the correspondent of the Figaro, who with friends had come to meet me. Ah, yes, madame, a great fête day today at Havre, for they are expecting the return of a fairy who left 7 months ago. Is it really in my honor that all these pretty boats have spread their wings and beflagged their masts? Oh, how happy I am! At this moment, we go alongside the jetty. There are perhaps 20,000 people there who cry out, "Vive Sarah Bernhardt!" I am dumbfounded. I do not expect any triumphant return. I am well aware that the performance given for the Life-Saving Society has won the hearts of the people of Havre, but I learn that trains have come from Paris, packed with people, to welcome my return. I feel my pulse. It is I. I am not dreaming. The boat stops opposite a red velvet tent, and an invisible orchestra strikes up an air from The Chalet, Arrêtons nous ici. I smile at this quite French childishness. I get off and walk through the midst of a hedge of smiling, kind faces of sailors who offer me flowers. Within the tent, all the lifesavers are waiting for me, wearing on their broad chests the medals they have so well deserved. Mr. Grossos, the president, reads to me the following address. Madame, as president, I have the honor to present to you a delegation from the Life-Saving Society of Havre, who have come to welcome you and express their gratitude for the sympathy you have so warmly worded in your transatlantic dispatch. We have also come to congratulate you on the immense success that you have met with every place you have visited during your adventurous journey. You have now conquered 2 worlds in incontestable popularity and artistic celebrity, and your marvelous talent, added to your personal charms, has affirmed abroad that France is always the land of art and the birthplace of elegance and beauty. A yet distant echo of the words you spoke in Denmark, evoking a deep and sad souvenir, still strikes on our ears. It repeats that your heart is as French as your talent, for in the midst of the feverish and burning success of the theater, you have never forgotten to unite your patriotism to your artistic triumphs. Our lifesavers have charged me with expressing to you their admiration for the charming benefactor whose generous hand has spontaneously stretched itself out toward their poor but noble society. They wish to offer you these flowers, gathered from the soil of the mother country, on the land of France, where you will find them everywhere under your feet. They are worthy that you should accept them with favor, for they are presented to you by the bravest and most loyal of our lifesavers. It is said that my reply was very eloquent, but I cannot affirm that the reply was really made by me. I had lived for several hours in a state of overexcitement from successive emotions. I had taken no food, had no sleep. My heart had not ceased beating, a moving and joyous charge. My brain had been filled with 1,000 facts that had been piled up for 7 months and narrated in 2 hours. This triumphant reception that I was far from expecting, after what had happened just before my departure, after having been so badly treated by the Paris press, after the incidents of my journey that had been always badly interpreted by several French papers. All these coincidences were of such different proportions that they seemed hardly credible. I preferred to remain in the latter dream that was so flattering to me. The performance furnished a fruitful harvest for the life-savers. As for me, I played La Dame aux Cameliers for the first time in France. God had come. I affirm that those who were present at that performance experienced the quintessence of what my personal art can give. I spent the night at my place at Saint-Adresse. The following I left for Paris. A most flattering ovation was awaiting me on my arrival. Then 3 days afterwards, installed in my hotel in the Avenue de Villiers, I received Victorien Sardou in order to hear the reading of his magnificent piece, Fedora. Ah, what a great artist! What an admirable actor! What a marvelous author! He read that play to me right off, playing every role, giving me in 1 second the vision of what I should do. Ah, I exclaimed, after the reading was over. Ah, dear master, thanks for this beautiful part. Thanks for the fine lesson you have just given me. That night left me without sleep, for I wished to catch a glimpse in the darkness of the small star in which I had faith. I saw it as dawn was breaking, and fell asleep thinking over the new era that it was going to lighten up. My artistic journey lasted 7 months. I visited 50 cities and gave 156 representations as follows. La Dame aux Cameliers, 65 performances. Adrienne Lecouvrier, 17 performances. Frou-Frou, 41 performances. La Princesse Georges, 3 performances. Eranie, 14 performances. L'Étrangère, 3 performances. Phèdre, 6 performances. Le Sphinx, 7 performances. Total receipts, 2,667,600 francs. Average receipts, 17,100 francs. I conclude these memories of mine here, for this is really the first halting place in my life, the real evolution of my physical and moral being. I had run away from the Comédie Française, from Paris, from France, from my family, and from my friends. I had thought of having a wild ride across mountain seas and space, and I came back in love with the vast horizon, but calmed down by the feeling of responsibility which for 7 months had been weighing on my shoulders. The terrible Jarret, with his implacable and cruel wisdom, had tamed my wild nature by a constant appeal to my probity. In those few months, my mind had matured, and the brusqueness of my will was softened. My life, which I thought at first was to be so short, seemed now likely to be very, very long, and that gave me a great mischievous delight whenever I thought of the infernal displeasure of my enemies. I resolved to live. I resolved to be the great artiste that I longed to be, and from the time of this return, I gave myself entirely up to my life.
End of section 31. Read by KimberlyB. End of Memories of My Life by Sarah Bernhardt.